The rhythmic thud of Thomas Mason's hammer was as reliable as a heartbeat in the growing town of Shadow Creek. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, each strike joining wood to wood with the expertise that had made him the most sought-after carpenter in 3 counties. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the half-finished schoolhouse windows, highlighting the sawdust that danced in the golden light. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mr. Mason! Young Billy Thompson's voice cracked with excitement as he ran up to the construction site. Mr. Mason, they're coming! The Raven gang's been spotted just outside town. Thomas barely paused his work, the hammer rising and falling in its steady rhythm. That so? He asked quietly, his voice carrying the soft drawl of Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. He was a tall man, lean but solid, with graying temples that belied his 45 years. His clothes were simple, cotton shirt, canvas pants, and a worn leather apron that had seen more sawdust than most men had seen suppers. Yes, sir, Sheriff Parker's gathering men at the saloon, says we need everybody. Billy bounced on his heels, his 12-year-old frame practically vibrating with nervous energy. Thomas carefully set down his hammer, using a cloth to wipe the sawdust from his calloused hands. Best run home then, Billy. Tell your ma to lock the doors, but ain't you coming to help? Pa says the Ravens have already hit 3 towns this month, killed 4 men in Silver Springs just last week. A shadow passed across Thomas's face, brief as a cloud across the sun. Sometimes the best help a man can offer is staying out of the way. He turned back to his work, picking up a piece of sandpaper. Go on now. You mall be worried. The saloon's swinging doors burst open as 3 riders strutted in, spurs jingling against the wooden floor. Their leader, Cole Blackjack Harrison, stood out even among his rough company. His black duster was adorned with silver buttons that caught the lamplight, and a pair of pearl-handled Colts rode low on his hips. Evening, folks. Blackjack's voice carried the practiced charm of a snake oil salesman. Hope we ain't interrupting nothing important. His eyes scanned the nervous faces of the patrons, noting the absence of the town sheriff. Just thought we'd stop in, maybe sample some of your fine whiskey. Behind the bar, Emma Sullivan, the saloon's owner since her husband's passing, kept her voice steady. We serve paying customers here, Mr. Harrison. Blackjack's smile didn't reach his eyes. Now, that ain't particularly hospitable, Miss Emma, especially since me and my boys rode so far to pay your fine establishment a visit. Gee, he moved to the bar with the casual menace of a mountain lion, his men spreading out to cover the room. The saloon had grown deathly quiet, save for the creaking of floorboards under nervous feet. Blackjack reached into his duster, causing several patrons to flinch, but withdrew only a gold coin, which he spun across the bar top. There's your payment. Now how about that whiskey? Emma's hand trembled slightly as she set out a bottle and glass. Blackjack poured himself a generous measure, raising it in a mock toast before downing it in one swallow. Fine whiskey indeed. Though I hear your establishment's been having some trouble lately. Protection ain't what it used to be, what with Sheriff Parker being stretched so thin. He poured another drink. Shame if anything were to happen. Fire's particularly dangerous in these wooden buildings. One spark. He snapped his fingers for emphasis. What do you want? Just to offer our services, ma'am. Small weekly payment. My boys make sure nothing unfortunate occurs. Simple as that. The sound of hammering from the schoolhouse drew Blackjack's attention. What's that racket? One of his men, a scarred fellow called Rattler, peered out the window. Just some carpenter, boss, still working on that schoolhouse. Working? When decent folk should be paying attention to important business? Blackjack's voice carried a dangerous edge. Rattler, why don't you go explain to our industrious friend the importance of proper timing? Thomas worked on, seemingly oblivious to the approaching gunman. The sun had dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Hey, Carpenter! Rattler's voice carried the casual cruelty of a man used to being feared. "Time to pack up them tools." Thomas set down his hammer with deliberate care, but didn't turn around. "Evening," he said quietly. "Still got daylight left. Work needs doing." Rattler's hand dropped to his holster. "Didn't ask about the daylight. Blackjack says, 'Stop working. You stop working.'" Now Thomas did turn, his movements unhurried. His eyes, grey as storm clouds, met Rattler's with a calm that seemed to unsettle the gunman slightly. "Don't believe I know any Blackjack," Thomas said. "But I do know there's children in this town who need a proper school come fall. Now, if you'll excuse me." He reached for his hammer. The sound of Rattler's gun-clearing leather was like a rattlesnake's warning. "Reach for that hammer." "I reach. For something meaner." "Last man made me draw," Rattler said, grinning now. "Ain't building nothing no more. In fact, he ain't doing much of anything these days, except pushing up daisies." Thomas straightened slowly, his expression unchanged. "Been my experience," he said softly, "that men who brag about killing tend to have mighty short futures themselves." Something in his tone made Rattler's grin falter. The gunman's eyes narrowed, studying Thomas more carefully now. "You got a familiar way about you, Carpenter. Like I saw you somewhere before." "Doubt that." Thomas turned back to his workbench. "I'm just a man who's good with wood." The rest of his words were cut off by shouts from the direction of the saloon. Both men turned to see Blackjack himself striding toward them, flanked by his remaining men. "Problem here, Rattler," Blackjack called out. "Thought I sent you to handle one simple carpenter." "Boss," Rattler said, his eyes still fixed on Thomas. "Something ain't right about this one. He reminds me of what?" Blackjack stopped a few paces away, looking Thomas up and down with contempt. "Some church-going woodworker who don't know his place?" He turned to the gathering crowd of townspeople. "Let this be a lesson, folks. When Blackjack Harrison's conducting business, all other business stops." Thomas picked up a piece of wood, examining it with careful attention. "God's work doesn't stop for any man's business, Mr. Harrison." A dangerous smile played across Blackjack's features. "That so? Well then, perhaps we need a proper demonstration of how things work in my territory." He looked at his men. "Boys, it seems this fine craftsman needs some schooling of his own. Show him what happens to his precious woodwork when he don't listen to reason." Two of the gang members moved toward the partially constructed schoolhouse, but before they could take another step, Thomas's quiet voice cut through the evening air like a steel blade. "I wouldn't." The authority in his tone, not loud, not threatening, but carrying weight that seemed to come from somewhere deep and dangerous, made the men hesitate. Even Blackjack's smile faltered for a moment. "And why's that, Carpenter?" Blackjack's hand moved closer to his gun. "Are you planning to stop us with that hammer of yours?" Thomas set down the piece of wood with careful precision. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different kind of authority, one that spoke of gun smoke and silent graves. "No, Mr. Harrison. If it comes to that, I'll stop you the same way I stopped the McClure gang in Texas, the same way I stopped the Whitfield brothers in Kansas." He turned, and suddenly his eyes weren't those of a simple carpenter anymore. They were the eyes of someone else entirely, someone who'd seen more than his share of killing grounds. "The same way I stopped every man foolish enough to think a fast gun made him righteous." The crowd had gone deathly silent. Several of Blackjack's men exchanged uncertain glances, their hands hovering near their holsters. In the distance, a church bell tolled, marking the hour as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Blackjack's face hardened, his earlier amusement replaced by cold calculation. "You're him, ain't you? They said you'd disappeared after that business in Dodge City, said you'd hung up your guns for good." His hand inched closer to his pearl-handled Colt. "The ghost of Virginia. Thomas Three-Shot Mason." A murmur ran through the crowd. Even those who'd never left Shadow Creek had heard the stories. Tales of a gunfighter so fast he could put 3 bullets through a man before the poor soul's hand even touched his weapon. A man who'd never lost a draw, never killed without cause, and one day simply vanished from the frontier. That was a lifetime ago, Thomas said quietly, his hands still resting on his workbench. I came here to build things, Mr. Harrison, not destroy them. Funny thing about the past, Blackjack's smile returned, but now it held the predatory gleam of a wolf that had cornered its prey. It has a way of catching up to a man, no matter how far he runs. Boys! He called to his men without taking his eyes off Thomas. Looks like we got a bonus today. The bounty on 3-Shot Mason's head is worth more than this whole miserable town. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The gang members spread out, forming a loose semicircle around the schoolhouse. The townspeople began backing away, mothers hurrying their children indoors, men looking anywhere but at the scene unfolding before them. Last, "Chance, Carpenter," Blackjack said, emphasizing the word with mock respect. "Come quiet, or we paint this schoolhouse of yours with something darker than wood stain." Thomas Mason's eyes scanned the semicircle of gunmen, noting positions, stances, the way each man held himself. Old habits died hard. 10 men, he said quietly, to kill 1 carpenter. 1 carpenter. Blackjack laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Way I heard it, you once took down 7 men in Silver City without even drawing your second gun. Figure 10 might make it sporting." A warm breeze stirred the sawdust at Thomas's feet. From somewhere down the street came the sound of shutters being hurriedly closed, the town battening down for the storm everyone could feel coming. "That was a different man," Thomas said. "In a different time." "Different man." Blackjack's voice dripped with mockery. "Let's see just how different." He nodded to one of his men, a tall Mexican wearing a silver-studded gun belt. "Vicente, check him for iron." Vicente moved forward cautiously, his dark eyes never leaving Thomas's face. He patted down the carpenter's clothes with quick professional movements. "Nada," he reported, stepping back. "No weapon." Blackjack's eyebrows rose. The famous 3-Shot Mason walking around unarmed? Now, that is different. His smile widened. "Makes our job a whole lot easier, don't it, boys?" "I told you," Thomas said, his voice carrying the patience of a man explaining something simple to a child. "I'm just here to build." "Build?" Blackjack spat on the ground. "Build what? A life hiding from who you really are? A reputation as some peace-loving carpenter?" He stepped closer, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. "Men like us, Mason, we don't change. We just find new ways to lie to ourselves." Thomas's hands remained steady on his workbench. "Maybe you're right, Mr. Harrison. Maybe we won't change." His eyes met Blackjack's. "But we can choose. Every day, we can choose." "Choice?" Blackjack laughed. "Only choice you have now is how. You want to die, on your feet like the gunfighter you pretend not to be, or on your knees like the coward you've become." A small figure darted out from between 2 buildings. "Mr. Mason!" Billy Thompson's voice rang out across the tense scene. "I brought help! Billy, get back!" Thomas's command cracked like a whip, freezing the boy in his tracks. In the same instant, Blackjack's gun appeared in his hand, aimed not at Thomas, but at the child. "Well, well," Blackjack drawled. "Seems we got some motivation after all." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Something cold, something that made Vicente take another step back. "Let the boy go," Thomas said, quietly. "This is between us. Between us." Blackjack's gun remained trained on Billy. "Everything's between all of us, Mason. Every choice, every consequence. You want to protect this town, these people, then it's time to show them who you really are." The evening shadows had grown longer, painting stark lines across the dusty street. In the distance, thunder rumbled, a summer storm brewing over the mountains. From the saloon doorway, Emma Sullivan watched with growing horror, her hands clasped over her mouth. Several of the townspeople had gathered at windows and doorways, drawn by the confrontation but too afraid to intervene. Sheriff Parker was nowhere to be seen, likely out checking the outlying farms after the initial warning about the Raven Gang. Thomas knew there would be no help coming from that quarter. This was between him and the ghosts he'd tried to leave behind. "You know, Mason," Blackjack drawled, his gun still trained on Billy, "I heard tell of how you quit the gun game. Story goes that you walked away after that mess in Dodge City." "Something. About a woman and a child?" He smiled as Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Hit a nerve, did I?" "That's enough," Thomas said, his voice carrying a warning that made several of Blackjack's men shift nervously. "Oh, but it ain't nearly enough," Blackjack continued. "See, I knew that woman's brother. Man you killed in that shootout, James Mackenzie, he was kin to me by marriage." His eyes glittered dangerously. "Guess you could say this reunion was meant to be." Thomas's expression remained neutral, but his mind raced back to that terrible day in Dodge, the shootout that had left 7 men dead, including young Mackenzie, who'd been barely more than a boy himself. It had been a fair fight, all of them calling him out together, but the boy's sister, her face as she cradled her dead brother, that was what had finally made Thomas Mason hang up his guns, or so he'd thought. "Billy," Thomas said, his voice gentle but firm. "Close your eyes, son." The boy trembled but obeyed, squeezing his eyes. Shut. In that same moment, Thomas's hand moved. It wasn't a dramatic movement. No flourish, no warning. One moment his hand was empty, the next it held a small derringer that had been concealed in his carpenter's apron. The shot cracked across the street like lightning. Blackjack's gun went spinning from his hand. A neat hole drilled through the cylinder. Before the weapon hit the ground, Thomas had already shifted his aim, the tiny derringer somehow now pointing at both Vicente and Rattler simultaneously. "That's one," Thomas said quietly. The street had gone. Absolutely still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Blackjack stared at his damaged gun, then at his bleeding hand, his face a mask of disbelief. "Impossible," he whispered. "A derringer. At that distance." "The stories," Vicente said, his voice hoarse. "They didn't do him justice." "Billy," Thomas called out, never taking his eyes off the gunman. "Open your eyes and walk backward, slow and steady. Your pa's waiting behind Anderson's store." The boy did as he was told, his boots scraping against the dusty street as he retreated. None of Blackjack's men dared move to stop him. "Now then," Thomas continued, his voice still quiet but carrying clearly in the silence. "We can do this one of 2 ways. You can gather up your wounded pride and your wounded hand, Mr. Harrison, and ride out of Shadow Creek. Or we can see if the stories about me are really true." Blackjack's face contorted with rage. "You think one lucky shot with a pocket gun makes you the man you used to be? Boys!" he bellowed to his men. $50 extra to whoever puts a bullet in this Carpenter." Guns appeared in hands all around. The semicircle. Thomas didn't appear concerned. If anything, a hint of sadness crossed his features. "The derringer was for the boy's sake," he said softly. "Didn't want him to see what's coming next." His free hand moved to his carpenter's belt, fingers closing around something that had looked like a common tool to all who'd seen him work. But as he pulled it free, the last rays of sunlight caught the metalwork that had been carefully disguised. Beneath wood shavings and sawdust, a Colt Peacemaker, its barrel modified, its grip worn smooth by years of use. The gun that had made him famous. "Sweet Jesus," Rattler breathed. "It's true. It's all true." "Last chance," Thomas said, the Colt, hanging loose but ready at his side. "Ride out, live to see tomorrow." "Take him!" Blackjack screamed, reaching for his backup gun with his uninjured hand. The street erupted in gunfire. Later, witnesses would argue about exactly what happened next. Some swore Thomas didn't move at all, that his gun seemed to fire of its own accord. Others insisted they saw him dance between the bullets, like a man blessed by God himself. The only thing they all agreed on was the precision, the terrible, beautiful precision. 3 shots rang out, distinct even in the chaos. 3 shots, just like the stories said. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Blackjack's men lay writhing in the dust, each clutching a shattered gun hand. 3 more stood frozen, their weapons somehow knocked from their grips by shots that had seemed to come from impossible angles. The remaining men, including Vicente, had their guns on the ground and their hands raised before Thomas even turned to face them. Only Blackjack remained, his backup gun halfway cleared from its holster, his face a mask of pure hatred. "You're still the same killer you always were," he snarled. "All this carpentry, all this pretending. You can't build anything that'll bury who you really are." Thomas's gun hadn't moved. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Harrison. I am what I am. But every man gets to choose what he builds with the tools God gave him." His eyes hardened. "I chose to build homes, futures, places where children can learn and grow. You chose to tear things down. That's the only difference that matters." Blackjack's gun hand twitched. "Pretty words," he spat. "Let's see if they stop bullets." His draw was fast, blindingly fast, the kind of speed that had left dozens of men dead in streets across the frontier. But Thomas Mason hadn't earned his nickname by being slow. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, so close together they almost sounded like one. Blackjack's gun went spinning away, his gun belt suddenly separated from its holster, and his hat lifted cleanly from his head. 3 shots, Thomas said quietly, just like always. 1 to disarm, 1 to disable, 1 to remind. He stepped forward, his gun unwavering. "I haven't killed a man in 5 years, Mr. Harrison. Don't make me start counting fresh today." Black. Jack stood frozen, blood trickling from a shallow graze on his gun hand. For a long moment, only the distant rumble of thunder broke the silence. Finally, the outlaw leader's shoulders slumped. "It's over, boys," he called to his remaining men. "Mount up." As the gang gathered their wounded and helped them onto horses, Thomas remained still, his gun trained on Blackjack. Only when the last rider had mounted did he speak again. "Don't come back to Shadow Creek," he said. "Next time won't be a demonstration." Blackjack's face was a study in conflicting emotions, rage, fear, and something that might have been respect. "They'll come for you now," he said. "Every gunfighter and bounty hunter between here and Mexico. 3-shot Mason back from the dead. Building schools won't keep them away." Thomas finally lowered his gun. "Maybe not. But that's tomorrow's problem. Today I've got work to finish." He turned back to his workbench, setting the Colt carefully beside his hammer. Daylight's wasting. The thunder grew closer as Blackjack and his men rode out of town, the setting sun casting their shadows long across the street. As they disappeared into the gathering dusk, Emma Sullivan hurried across from the saloon, her skirts rustling in the evening breeze. "Mr. Mason," she said, her voice trembling slightly. We had no idea all this time." "No reason you should have, Miss Emma," Thomas replied, already turning back to his workbench, but she caught his arm, making him pause. "My David," she said softly, "my late husband. He used to tell stories about 3-shot Mason, said he was the fastest gun anybody's ever seen, but he never drew first and never killed without cause." Her eyes searched his face. "Said he was a legend." Thomas gently removed her hand from his arm. "Legends have a way of growing bigger than the men they're about, Miss Emma. Your David sounds like he was a good man. Best honor him by remembering him, not stories about strangers." "But you're not a stranger anymore," she insisted. "You're part of Shadow Creek now. Those men, they'll be back, or others will come. You can't just pretend today didn't happen." Thomas picked up his hammer, its weight familiar and comforting in his hand. "I'm not pretending anything, just choosing what kind of man I want to be, one day at a time." "Mr. Mason?" Billy's voice came from behind him, small but steady. Are you really him? Three-shot Mason?" Thomas turned to find not just Billy, but what seemed like the whole town emerging from their hiding places, looking at him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "I was," he said simply. "Now I'm just a carpenter, one who'd appreciate some help raising these walls before the storm hits." He held out a spare hammer. "Want to learn how to build something, Billy?" The boy's face lit up as he took the tool, and slowly others began stepping forward, men and women who'd hidden from the gunfight now offering their hands to help build. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, the sound of hammers filled the air once more. Thomas Mason worked alongside them, his movements sure and steady. Sheriff Parker finally returned as the first walls were going up, taking in the scene of townspeople working together with obvious surprise. "Heard there was trouble," the sheriff said, approaching Thomas. "Heard Three-Shot Mason handled it." Thomas drove another nail home before answering. "No trouble, Sheriff. Just some men who needed reminding that Shadow Creek's not the kind of town they're looking for." Parker nodded slowly, understanding passing between the two men. "And Three-Shot Mason? He's still retired," Thomas said firmly. "Just a carpenter here, nothing more." "Might not be that simple," Parker warned. "Word will spread. Men with something to prove, bounty hunters looking to make a name." "Then they'll find a carpenter," Thomas replied, "unless they force him to be something else." He paused in his work, meeting Parker's eyes. "But I'd appreciate your help in making sure it doesn't come to that." The sheriff considered this, then extended his hand. "Welcome to Shadow Creek, Mr. Mason." Officially. As they shook hands, the storm finally broke overhead, rain pattering on the partially finished roof, but no one made a move to leave. The gun remained on Thomas's workbench, slowly gathering sawdust, a tool he hoped would stay unused, but never far from reach. After all, a good carpenter knew that sometimes the right tool made all the difference between building something that would last and watching it all come crashing down. The rain continued to fall as the townspeople worked together, transforming the schoolhouse from a skeleton of timber into something more, not just a building, but a symbol of the kind of future Thomas Mason had chosen to build. With each strike of his hammer, he drove another nail into the coffin of his old life, hoping it would stay buried this time. But even as he worked, he couldn't help but remember Blackjack's parting words, "They'll come for you now." And deep down, Thomas knew the outlaw was right. The past had a way of finding you, no matter how many new foundations you tried to build over it. Still, that was tomorrow's problem. Today, there was work to be done, a community to build, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at redemption, one wooden beam at a time. Word travels fast in the West. By the time the sun rose over Shadow Creek the next morning, riders were already spreading the news across 3 territories. Three-Shot Mason was back. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow as he worked on the schoolhouse's roof trusses, the morning sun already burning hot. Below, Billy Thompson handed up tools and lumber, having appointed himself the carpenter's unofficial apprentice. "Mr. Mason," Billy called up, "there's riders coming." Thomas didn't pause his work, but his eyes flicked to the workbench where his colt rested beneath a layer of sawdust. "How many?" "Just 2. Looked like regular folks, not like Blackjack's men." The riders approached at an unhurried pace, a man and woman, their horses trail-worn. The woman wore a black dress, her face hidden beneath a dark veil. Thomas's hands stilled on the roof beam as recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Sarah Mackenzie," he breathed. Billy looked up, confused. "You know them, Mr. Mason." "Get inside." "The schoolhouse, Billy, now." The boy hesitated only a moment before obeying, recognizing the tone in Thomas's voice. The same tone from yesterday, right before the shooting started. Thomas climbed down from the roof with deliberate care, dusting off his hands as the riders drew up in front of the schoolhouse. The man he didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with the look of an Eastern lawyer about him. But the woman, she dismounted without assistance, her movements graceful despite her mourning clothes. When she lifted her veil, her face was exactly as Thomas remembered it, beautiful, proud, and carved with grief that 5 years hadn't softened. "Hello, Thomas," she said quietly. "Mrs. Mackenzie." He inclined his head slightly. "Long way from Dodge City. It's Mrs. Collins now." She gestured to her companion, who'd also dismounted. "My husband, Charles Collins, a federal prosecutor." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his stomach. He'd wondered when the law would finally catch up to him. Collins stepped forward, his manner professional but not unfriendly. "Mr. Mason, your reputation precedes you." "Does it?" Thomas turned back to his work. "I'm just a carpenter now." "So we heard," Sarah said, an edge creeping into her voice. "Building schools, living a quiet life. Tell me, do you sleep well at night, Mr. Mason? Do the faces of the men you've killed haunt your dreams?" Thomas set down his hammer carefully. "Every night, ma'am, your brothers most of all." "James was 19, she said, her composure cracking slightly. "Barely more than a boy. A boy who called me out along with 6 other men," Thomas replied quietly. "A boy who drew first and shot to kill. He was avenging our father." Sarah's voice rose. "The father you gunned down in Santa Fe. Your father drew on me over a card." "A game he was cheating at," Thomas said, his voice remaining level. "I gave him every chance to walk away." Charles Collins cleared his throat. "Mr. Mason, we're not here about past grievances. We're here about Blackjack Harrison." Thomas turned to face them fully now. "What about him?" "He's been terrorizing settlements across 3 territories, Collins explained. "Robbery, extortion, murder. The federal government wants him stopped, but he's proven elusive." "Until yesterday," Sarah added, when 3-shot Mason came out of retirement. Understanding dawned. "You want me to hunt him?" Collins nodded. "With proper authority, of course, a federal marshal's badge, full backing of the law, and a chance to make amends," Sarah said softly. "To use your skills for justice instead of just adding to the body count." Thomas looked at the half-finished schoolhouse, at the fresh-cut lumber waiting to be transformed into something meaningful. "I left that life behind." "Did you?" Sarah stepped closer. "Or are you just hiding from it? Yesterday proved you haven't. Changed, Thomas. You're still the same man who can end a fight with 3 shots. The only difference is whether you use that skill for something worthwhile." "Building a school is worthwhile," Thomas countered. "Building a school while men like Blackjack Harrison destroy other communities," Collins asked. "How many schools will he burn? How many lives will he ruin while you play at reformation?" Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. Sheriff Parker rode up, his expression concerned. "Thomas," he called out, "got word from Copper Canyon. Blackjack's gang hit them last night. Burned half the town, killed 3 men who tried to stand up to them." He noticed the visitors. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't," Thomas said grimly. "How many dead total?" 5, including a boy about Billy's age who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sarah's face paled. Another child, another life cut short, because violent men are allowed to roam free. She turned to Thomas. "How many more, Mr. Mason? How many more deaths will you allow while you hide behind your carpenter's apron?" Thomas walked to his workbench, running his fingers over the worn wood. "You're right about one thing, Mrs. Collins. I haven't changed. Not really." He brushed away the sawdust covering his colt. I'm still the man who can't walk away when there's killing to be stopped. He picked up the gun, checking it with practiced movements that 5 years hadn't dulled. But you're wrong about something else. I'm not hiding from who I am. I'm trying to be more than just a killer. Then be more, Collins said, producing a marshal's badge from his coat. Be the law. Thomas stared at the badge for a long moment. If I do this, if I put on that badge, I do it my way. No possessions, no civilian casualties, no collateral damage. Just me, hunting them clean. Collins nodded. Those are exactly the terms we were hoping for. Your reputation for precision is why we sought you out. And afterward? Thomas asked. When Black Jack's dealt with? Afterward, you can go back to building your school, Collins promised, with a full pardon for any outstanding warrants from your previous activities. Sarah stepped forward again, but this time there was something different in her expression. Not quite forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. James made his choice. That day in Dodge, I've had 5 years to accept that. Maybe it's time we both stop letting the ghosts of the past determine our futures. Thomas holstered his gun with fluid grace, muscle memory unchanging despite the years. Billy, he called out, you can come out now. The boy emerged from the schoolhouse, eyes wide with excitement. Are you going after Black Jack, Mr. Mason? Looks that way. Thomas turned to Sheriff Parker. I'll need someone to oversee the schoolhouse construction while I'm gone. Make sure it's done right. Parker nodded. I'll see to it personally. Thomas knelt down to Billy's level. Think you can help the sheriff? Show him everything I taught. You about proper joinery and load-bearing walls? Billy straightened proudly. Yes, sir, Mr. Mason. Good boy. Thomas stood, accepting the badge from Collins and pinning it to his vest. The weight of it felt strange, both foreign and familiar, like the gun on his hip. I'll need to make some preparations, get my old gear from storage. We've heard Black Jack's headed south, Collins informed him, toward the Mexican border. Our sources suggest he has connections with the Vasquez brothers, Manuel and Ricardo Vasquez. Thomas nodded grimly. Gun runners. They control the weapons. Trade from El Paso to Chihuahua. Dangerous men. You know them? Sarah asked. Thomas's eyes took on a distant look. Crossed paths with them in '68. They were smaller then, just starting to build their empire. Had a disagreement over some merchandise they were selling to Apache renegades. What kind of disagreement? Collins pressed. The kind that left Ricardo with a limp and Manuel with one less brother. Thomas checked his ammunition. They won't have forgotten. No, Thomas said with quiet certainty. A man like that, wounded in his pride, he's not running, he's gathering allies. He'll be back, and he'll bring an army with him. He looked at Sarah. You might want to be well clear of Shadow Creek when that happens. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I've spent 5 years running from the violence that took my brother and father. Maybe it's time I stopped running too. She glanced at her. Husband, we'll stay, help with the school. It seems fitting. Thomas nodded slowly. Sheriff, I need you to send telegrams to every settlement within 50 miles. Warn them about Black Jack, but also spread the word. 3-Shot Mason is hunting. Anyone who stands with Harrison will face the same justice he does. That'll certainly get their attention, Parker said with a grim smile. One more thing, Thomas added. Miss Emma at the saloon, she's good with numbers. Have her help Billy and Mrs. Collins with the school planning. She's been wanting to do more for the community. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You've built quite a life here. I'm trying to, Thomas agreed, which is why Black Jack Harrison and his kind need to be stopped. A community can't grow in the shadow of men like that. He checked his gun one final time. Time to remind them why they used to fear the sound of 3 shots. Emma Sullivan emerged from the saloon, carrying a package wrapped in oilcloth. Mr. Mason, she called out, hurrying over. Before you go. She handed him the package. Inside was a gun belt, the leather well-oiled and supple. "It was David's," she explained softly. "He'd want you to have it. Said you were the only man he ever saw who truly understood that a gun was meant to protect, not destroy." Thomas ran his fingers over the tooled leather. "Your husband was a wise man, Miss Emma. He also said," she continued, a slight flush coloring her cheeks, "that if anything ever happened to him, I should find someone who built things up instead of tearing them down." Her eyes met his. "Just come back to us, Thomas. There's more here worth building than just a school." From the corner of his eye, Thomas noticed Sarah Collins watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. The weight of past and present, of old obligations and new possibilities, settled heavily on his shoulders. As he mounted his horse, borrowed from the livery stable, Billy ran up one last time. "Mr. Mason, will you come back after you catch Blackjack?" Thomas looked at the schoolhouse, at the town he'd chosen as his home, at the faces of people who'd accepted him despite his past. "Count on it, Billy, we've got school to finish." He turned his horse south, toward the territory where he knew Blackjack would be gathering his forces. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the street, the shadow not of a carpenter, but of a legend reborn. Three-Shot Mason was riding again, one last time, to earn the peace he'd tried to build with hammer and nail. Before riding out, Thomas made one last stop at his modest cabin on the edge of town. Inside, he pulled up a floorboard beneath his bed, revealing a worn leather case he hadn't opened in 5 years. The brass key was still around his neck, where he'd kept it as a reminder. Inside lay the tools of his former trade, a second Colt, matching the one on his hip, its bluing worn but its action still smooth as silk. A box of custom ammunition he'd on special ordered from a gunsmith in St. Louis, a folded leather map with carefully marked locations, hideouts, water sources, and danger spots across 3 territories, and at the bottom, wrapped in soft cloth, a silver pocket watch. He opened it, revealing the inscription inside. "To my son Thomas, may you always know when to stand and when to walk away. Father." His father had been a peace officer in Virginia before the war, a man who believed in justice tempered with mercy. He died trying to stop a bank robbery when Thomas was 15, his own sense of duty preventing him from drawing first on desperate men. Thomas had spent the next 15 years becoming the fastest drawer in the West, telling himself he was honoring his father's legacy of justice. It wasn't until that day in Dodge City, watching young Mackenzie fall, that he'd finally understood his father's last lesson about knowing when to walk away. Now strapping on the second gun and securing the extra ammunition, Thomas wondered what his father would think of this moment. Was he failing the lesson, or finally understanding it completely? "A man can walk away from who he was," he murmured, touching the watch one last time before tucking it into his vest pocket, "but not from who he needs to be." As he rode south out of Shadow Creek, the morning sun at his back, Thomas Mason felt the weight of both his identities: the carpenter who built futures and the gunman who ended them. Behind him, the sound of construction resumed on the schoolhouse, a reminder of what he was fighting for, and ahead lay the reckoning that had been 5 years in the making. Blackjack was right about one thing: the past had a way of catching up to a man, but this time Thomas Mason would meet it on his own terms, not as a killer seeking revenge, but as a builder protecting what he'd built. The 3 shots that had made him famous would ring out again, not to add to his legend, but to finally end it. The road stretched out before him, empty and promising, like a fresh piece of wood waiting to be shaped into something meaningful. All it needed was the right tools and the wisdom to know how to use them. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as Thomas Mason rode south, following a trail that most men would have missed. 5 years of peace hadn't dulled the tracking skills he'd learned the hard way, skills that had kept him alive when half the gunslingers in the West had wanted him dead. Blackjack's gang had split up after leaving Shadow Creek, but Thomas could. Read the signs like words on a page. The main group had headed southeast toward the Vasquez brothers' territory, but a smaller party had broken off, riding hard toward Mesa Rouge, a dying mining town that had become a haven for outlaws and hired guns. Recruiting, Thomas muttered, studying the tracks. He'd seen this pattern before. Blackjack was gathering an army. The sound of approaching riders made him guide his horse into the shelter of a rocky outcropping. 3 men passed below, riding. Hard, their horses lathered. Thomas recognized one of them, Jake Deadeye McGraw, a bounty hunter known for bringing in his targets more dead than alive. "Are you sure about this information?" one of the riders asked McGraw. "Sure as silver," McGraw replied. 3-shot Mason's back in the game. "Word is he's carrying a marshal's badge now, hunting Blackjack Harrison." He spat into the dust. "Figure we got 2 choices. Help Harrison take him down and split the bounty, or try our luck taking Mason ourselves." "You're crazy, McGraw. Nobody ever collected that bounty on Mason. Man's too fast." "Was too fast," McGraw corrected. 5 years is a long time to go soft, build schools and play for the citizens. Way I see it, his reputation is worth more than his skill now. The riders passed, their voices fading into the desert wind. Thomas waited a few moments longer before emerging from his hiding place. The situation was worse than he'd feared. Every gunman and desperado in the territory would be converging on this hunt, drawn by the legend of 3-shot Mason like moths to a flame. He spurred his horse toward Mesa Rouge. If Blackjack was gathering hired guns, that's where he'd start. The town had a reputation as a place where a man with enough gold could buy anything, including loyalty. As the sun began to set, Thomas caught sight of Mesa Rouge in the distance. The town sprawled across a red rock plateau, its buildings a jumble of adobe and weathered wood. In its glory days, it had been a prosperous silver mining center. Now, with the mines played out, it survived on the money that flowed through its saloons and gambling halls. He rode past the town's faded welcome sign, noting the fresh bullet holes that peppered it. The streets were busy, despite the late hour, filled with the kind of men who preferred to do their business in the shadows. More than a few hands drifted toward gun belts as he passed, but something in his bearing, or perhaps the marshal's badge catching the last rays of sunlight, made them reconsider. The Golden Nugget Saloon was the largest building in town, its gaudy facade a reminder of better days. Thomas dismounted, securing his horse at the hitching post. 2 men at a nearby table stopped their card game to stare at him, their hands disappearing beneath the table. "Well, I'll be damned," one of them muttered. "Josh, you see what I'm seeing?" 3-shot Mason, the other breathed. "My pa lost his brother to those guns in Yuma." Thomas ignored them, climbing the wooden steps where a burly man with a shotgun blocked his path. A fresh scar ran from his left eye to his jaw, and his cauliflower ears marked him as a former prize fighter. "Private establishment," the man growled. "Members only," Thomas met his gaze calmly. "Tell Manuel Vasquez that Thomas Mason would like a word." "Mason?" The bouncer's expression shifted subtly. "The Mason that shot Ricardo Vasquez?" "The same." The bouncer's grip tightened on his shotgun. "Got a lot of nerve showing your face here, Marshal. Ricardo was family to me, taught me everything I know about the fighting game." "Then you know he drew first," Thomas said quietly, "and you know what happened to men who stood in my way." A tense moment passed before the bouncer's shoulders slumped slightly. "Yeah, I know the stories." He disappeared inside, returning moments later with a decidedly more respectful demeanor. "Mr. Vasquez will see you. This way." The interior of the Golden Nugget was a study in faded opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their light reflecting off mirrors stained by years of tobacco smoke. At the far end of the gambling hall, a private table was separated from the main floor by velvet ropes. Manuel Vasquez hadn't changed much in 7 years. He was still immaculately dressed, his black hair and mustache perfectly groomed. Only the increasing grey at his temples and the deep lines around his eyes betrayed the passage of time. "Senor Mason," Vasquez said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Or should I say, Marshal Mason, please sit, share a drink with an old acquaintance." Thomas remained standing. "Where's Blackjack Harrison?" Vasquez's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Direct as always. That was your problem, you know. No appreciation for the social graces." He poured himself a glass of tequila. "I haven't seen Senor Harrison, though I hear he's recently had an interesting encounter in Shadow Creek. He's buying guns from you, Manuel. Same way you used to supply the Apaches." "Allegedly supplied the Apaches," Vasquez corrected smoothly. "Just as I allegedly helped Senor Harrison acquire certain materials. But you have no proof of this, Marshal. Only old suspicions and older grudges." "Your brother walked with a limp after our last meeting," Thomas said quietly. "Would have. Been worse if he hadn't dropped his gun." The smile vanished from Vasquez's face. "Ricardo never fully recovered from that day. He died last winter. Infection in the leg. The same leg you shot. He drew first. He was protecting our business. You were selling weapons to raiders who were massacring settlers," Thomas countered, "including women and children." Vasquez waved a hand dismissively. "Ancient history. We are all different men. Now know you, the famous gunfighter, became a carpenter. Me, a legitimate businessman." His smile returned, sharp as a knife. "Although I hear you have recently resumed your former profession. I'm hunting one man, Manuel, just Harrison. Stand clear of this, and we can maintain our professional courtesy." "Professional courtesy?" Vasquez laughed, but there was steel beneath the humor. "You know, when Ricardo died, he spoke of you. Even in his fever dreams, he muttered about the man who shot him. Not with hate, interestingly enough, with respect." He poured another drink. "He said you could have killed him that day, but you chose not to. Said it haunted him more than if you had." "I don't kill unless I have to," Thomas replied. "No?" Vasquez raised an eyebrow. "The bodies in your wake suggest otherwise. 16 men by my count, each one with a story, with family." He lifted his glass. "To the ghosts we both carry, eh? The ones your weapons created outnumber mine." "Ah, but I never pulled the trigger myself. My hands are clean, legally speaking. You—" Vasquez smiled thinly. "Your hands built that school in Shadow Creek, yes? Tell me, do the children know what else those hands have done?" Thomas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of old pain. "Where is Harrison?" "Direct as always," Vasquez sighed. "That was your problem, you know. No appreciation for the social graces." He poured another glass of tequila. "I haven't seen Senor Harrison, though I hear he's recently had an interesting encounter in Shadow Creek." Vasquez studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "I truly do not know. But—" He paused, swirling his tequila. "There is a camp in the high country north of here, a place where certain men gather to discuss business opportunities. If Harrison is building an army, as you suggest, he will need to visit this place." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because, Senor Mason, you are not the only one who remembers the past." Vasquez's eyes hardened. "When you find Harrison, give him a message from me. Tell him that dealing with Manuel Vasquez is like dealing with the devil. The price is always higher than you expect. Harrison crossed you. Let us say that his payment methods were not entirely satisfactory." Vasquez smiled again, but this time there was genuine humor in it. "Perhaps I am not as legitimate a businessman as I claimed." Thomas turned to leave, but Vasquez called after him. "One more thing, Marshal. Jake McGraw and his men. They passed through here yesterday. They are hunting you, along with half the gunmen in the territory. The bounty on your head has doubled since you put on that badge. Noted. You know what they say about old age and treachery, my friend. Thomas paused at the door. That they beat youth and skill. See, Vasquez raised his glass in a mocking toast. But what happens when a man has both? We shall see. No? Outside, the street had grown quieter, but Thomas could feel eyes watching from the shadows. A group of ranch hands quickly crossed to the other side when they saw him. From an upstairs window, a painted woman watched him with obvious interest, then quickly drew her curtains when he looked up. Near his horse, the two card players from earlier still lingered. The one called Josh stood as Thomas approached. "Marshal," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "My uncle, the one you killed in Yuma. Before you shot him, he told my pa you gave him a chance to walk away, said he was too proud to take it." He swallowed hard. "Pa never forgave him for that, for leaving us over pride." Thomas mounted his horse carefully, keeping both men in his peripheral vision. "Every man makes his own choices. Why did you become a carpenter? Trying to build something to make up for all you tore down?" "Maybe," Thomas admitted. "Or maybe I just got tired of watching proud men die for nothing." Josh nodded slowly. "McGraw and his boys, they're up at Lost Pine, looking to make a name for themselves by bringing you in." He straightened his shoulders. "Thought you should know, for my pa's sake. He said a man who gives his enemy a fair chance deserves the same." Thomas touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Much obliged." As he rode north toward Lost Pine and whatever waited there, Thomas reflected on Josh's words. Every man makes his own choices. He'd chosen to hang up his guns once, chosen peace over violence. Now he was choosing again, but this time it wasn't about his reputation or his skill. It was about protecting what he'd built, not just a school, but a chance at redemption. The ghost town of Lost Pine waited ahead, where an old debt waited to be collected, and an old friend might prove to be his deadliest enemy. But first, he had a letter to write. If things went wrong, someone in Shadow Creek deserved to know why. He pulled out a small notebook he'd taken to carrying for sketching building plans. In the fading light he wrote, "Miss Emma, if you're reading this, then things didn't go as planned. The school plans are in my cabin, under the loose floorboard with my father's watch. Give both to Billy. He's got a good eye for woodwork and a better one for justice. Maybe he'll build something that lasts longer than a gunfighter's reputation. As for what might have been between us, some things we build stay standing only in our dreams. Take care of our town. Thomas." He sealed the letter and tucked it into his vest pocket next to his father's watch. Then he turned his horse toward the high country, where old ghosts and new enemies waited. The sun was setting behind him, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, as if nature itself was warning of what was to come. Lost Pine lived up to its name. The abandoned mining town crouched in a valley between two ridges, its buildings slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. A single pine tree, dead and lightning-struck, stood like a lonely sentinel at the town's entrance. Thomas approached cautiously, reading the signs of recent activity. Fresh horse tracks, a tendril of smoke from a chimney, boot prints in the dust. McGraw wasn't bothering to hide his presence. That could mean confidence, or it could mean a trap. He dismounted at the edge of town, leading his horse behind an abandoned stable. The morning sun cast long shadows through the empty buildings, providing plenty of cover for him and anyone waiting to ambush him. "Come on out, McGraw," he called, his voice carrying in the still air. "We both know you're here." Laughter echoed from the old assayer's office. "Still direct as ever, Mason." Jake McGraw emerged onto the wooden porch, a Winchester rifle held casually in his hands. "Though I heard you'd gone soft. Building schools, playing with children, that true?" "Parts of it." Thomas kept his hands loose at his sides, aware of movement in other buildings. "How many men have you got hiding in the shadows, Jake?" "Enough." McGraw grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "But I'm more interested in who's riding with you. The great three-shot Mason working alone. Or did you bring that Apache scout you used to run with? Swift Arrow's dead. Thomas's voice was flat. You knew that? McGraw's grin widened. Course I did. I'm the one who killed him. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. Swift Arrow had been more than a scout. He'd been a friend, a brother in all but blood. They'd tracked together, fought together, saved each other's lives more times than either could count. Then 5 years ago, just before Thomas quit the gun game, Swift Arrow had disappeared while tracking rustlers. He was alone, McGraw continued, clearly enjoying himself. Up in the high country, following some trail. Never even saw me coming. He shifted the rifle. Kind of like you didn't see this coming, eh, Mason? Movement caught Thomas's eye, curtains twitching, shadows shifting in doorways. At least 6 men, maybe more, all with weapons trained on him. Why? Thomas asked quietly. Swift Arrow never did you any harm. No, but killing him hurts you, and that was worth something to certain parties. McGraw spat tobacco juice into the dust. Same parties that are mighty interested in Blackjack Harrison's current activities. Understanding dawned. The Vasquez brothers, they hired you to kill Swift Arrow, among others. Been watching you a long time, Mason, waiting for the right moment. McGraw's voice hardened. 5 years we waited. 5 years of watching you play at being respectable. Now here you are, walking right into our trap. Funny thing about traps, Thomas said, his eyes scanning the buildings. They work both ways. McGraw laughed again. You think you can take all of us? Maybe back in your prime, but now you're just a carpenter with delusions of... The rest of his words were cut off by the sound of a rifle shot. The bullet kicked up dust at McGraw's feet, making him jump back. That would be Mr. Winchester, Thomas said calmly. The gunsmith from Shadow Creek. Fine shot with a Sharps rifle. He's up on the North Ridge. Another shot rang out from the opposite direction. And that would be young Billy Thompson's father, former cavalry sharpshooter, South Ridge. McGraw's confident smile faltered. You're bluffing, am I? Thomas hadn't moved, his hands still away from his guns. Thing about being a carpenter, Jake. You learn the value of good preparation. I spent 2 days setting this up while you thought I was tracking Blackjack south. More riders appeared at the edge of town. Sheriff Parker and 3 deputies, all with rifles ready. From behind the buildings, Emma Sullivan emerged, holding a shotgun with obvious familiarity. Lady's got a good eye, Thomas commented. Her late husband taught her well. McGraw's men began emerging from their hiding spots, hands raised. The bounty hunter himself stood frozen, the Winchester now hanging loose in his grasp. How? He demanded. How did you know? Didn't, Thomas admitted. Not until Manuel Vasquez was too eager to tell me where to find Blackjack. Made me suspicious. Started asking questions. His voice hardened. Found a man in Mesa Rouge who remembered. Selling you information about Swift Arrow's movements 5 years ago. So what now, Mason? McGraw's eyes darted between the surrounding rifles. Are you going to kill me like you killed all those others? No. Thomas finally moved, but not. Toward his guns. He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded paper. I'm going to arrest you. For the murder of Swift Arrow, for conspiracy with the Vasquez brothers, and for attempting to ambush a federal marshal. He turned to Sheriff Parker. Get these men secured. I want them all alive to testify about the Vasquez connection. As the deputies began disarming and binding the would-be ambushers, Emma approached Thomas. That was quite a performance, she said quietly. But you didn't really have this all planned out, did you? Thomas's lips twitched in a slight smile. Let's just say I learned from Swift Arrow that sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to walk right into it, with friends waiting in the right places. And if we hadn't followed you, if we hadn't guessed what you were riding into, then I suppose I would have had to handle it the old way. His hand brushed the grip of his Colt. But I'm trying to build something different now, something that lasts. Emma's eyes softened. Speaking of building, that letter in your vest pocket. The one you wrote last night in Mesa Rouge. Were you planning to tell me about that? Thomas blinked in surprise. How did you— I have my sources, she said, with a small smile. And I want you to know what might have been between us. Maybe. It doesn't have to stay just in dreams. Before Thomas could respond, Sheriff Parker called out, "Marshal, we got a problem!" "McGraw's talking, and you're going to want to hear this." McGraw sat in the dust, his hands bound, but there was a strange smile on his face. "You think you're clever, Mason? Think you figured it all out? While you were setting up this little trap, Blackjack's been busy, real busy." "What do you mean? Why do you think we were so obvious about waiting here? Why do you think Vasquez was so helpful?" McGraw laughed. "We're the distraction, you fool. Blackjack's not gathering an army to fight you. He's gathering an army to destroy everything you built. By now his men should be hitting Shadow Creek. That school you love so much won't be standing much longer." Thomas felt his blood run cold. Sarah and Charles Collins were still in Shadow Creek, Billy's parents, the schoolhouse he'd built with his own hands. "How many men?" he demanded. "Enough to burn your precious town to the ground." McGraw's smile was pure malice. "Guess you better choose, Marshal. Stay here and arrest us proper-like, or ride back and maybe save what's left of your new life. But you can't do both." Thomas looked at Sheriff Parker, who nodded grimly. "Go. We'll handle these snakes." "I'm coming with you," Emma declared, already mounting her horse. "No," Thomas said firmly. "I need you here. These men are the key to bringing down the Vasquez. Brothers, without their testimony all of this was for nothing, and without help you're riding into another trap," she countered. "Maybe." Thomas checked his guns with practiced efficiency. "But sometimes a trap is exactly where you need to be." He met her eyes. "Keep that letter safe for me. I plan to discuss it when I get back." As he mounted up, McGraw called after him. "You'll never make it in time. Blackjack's got 30 men at least." Thomas turned his horse toward Shadow Creek, the morning sun at his back. "Then I better not waste any more time talking." He spurred his mount into a gallop, leaving Lost Pine and its ghosts behind. Swift Arrow's murder was avenged, but there would be time to reflect on that later. Right now, all that mattered was distance and speed, and the hope that he wasn't already too late. The desert blurred past as he rode, his mind racing faster than his horse's hooves. Blackjack had played this well, using Thomas's own reputation against him. The famous three-shot Mason would never back down from a direct challenge, never run from a fight. They'd counted on that, used it to draw him away from what really mattered. But Blackjack had forgotten something important. Thomas Mason wasn't just a gunfighter anymore. He was a builder now, a man who understood that sometimes the strongest structures were the ones you were willing to die protecting, and he'd be damned if he'd let them burn down his town without a fight. Thomas pushed his horse hard across the desert, taking risks he wouldn't normally consider. Every minute counted now. The sun had climbed higher, and dark smoke on the horizon sent a chill through his blood. Shadow Creek was still hours away at best. His mount stumbled slightly, reminding him that even the best horse had limits. He reined in reluctantly, allowing the animal to catch its breath. As he did, hoofbeats approached from behind. "Thought you might need this," a familiar voice called. Billy Thompson's father rode up, leading a fresh horse. "Emma figured you would. Said something about you being too stubborn to pace yourself." Thomas managed a grim smile. "She knows me too well already." He switched mounts quickly, checking his guns as he did. "The others?" "Parker's got McGraw and his boys locked down tight. Emma's already getting statements about the Vasquez connection." Thompson handed over a canteen. "But there's something else you should know. 2 riders came through Lost Pine right after you left, heading to Shadow Creek by the East Trail. One of them was Manuel Vasquez himself." Thomas's jaw tightened. "He played me for a fool, maybe. Or maybe he's playing both sides." Thompson adjusted his rifle in its scabbard. "Man like that, hard to tell where his true loyalties lie." His loyalty is to profit, Thomas said grimly, and there's more money in weapons than legitimate business. He gathered the reins of his fresh mount. I have to go. I know. Thompson hesitated. My boy, Billy, he's still in town. I'll find him, Thomas promised. Get him somewhere safe. That's not what I'm saying. Thompson's weathered face showed a father's concern. Billy believes in you, Mason. I think you're some kind of hero. Just whatever happens in Shadow Creek, remember there are young eyes watching, learning what kind of man to be. The words hit home, reminding Thomas of his own father's legacy. I understand. He spurred his horse forward, leaving Thompson behind. The fresh mount ate up the miles, but Thomas's mind raced faster than any horse could run. 30 men, McGraw had said. Too many for one man to handle, even if he was the fastest gun in the territory. But Shadow Creek wasn't just any town. Its people had taken in a stranger, trusted him, helped him build something meaningful. They deserved better than to see it all burn because of his past. As he rode, he mentally mapped the town's layout. Buildings he'd helped construct, alleys he knew by heart, lines of sight from various rooftops. A carpenter's eye for detail combined with a gunfighter's tactical mind. If he couldn't match Blackjack's numbers, he'd have to use the town itself as a weapon. The smoke on the horizon grew thicker. When he finally crested the last rise overlooking Shadow Creek, his heart nearly stopped. Several buildings were already ablaze, including the general store. Gunfire echoed through the streets, but it wasn't the one-sided slaughter he'd feared. The townspeople were fighting back. From his vantage point, he could see defenders on several rooftops, including the church steeple. Someone, probably Sarah Collins, given her Eastern education, had organized a proper defense. But Blackjack's men had them pinned down, slowly tightening the noose around the town center. Movement caught his eye, a group of riders approaching from the east. Manuel Vasquez and his companion right on schedule. But instead of joining Blackjack's forces, they held back, watching from a distant ridge. Thomas's mind raced, analyzing angles and options. The main fighting seemed concentrated around the town square, but that couldn't be Blackjack's real target. The man was too clever for a simple frontal assault. This was another distraction, which meant the schoolhouse. It sat on the edge of town, still under construction. From his position, Thomas could see 3 men working their way toward it through the back alleys, and there, moving between buildings, with far too much confidence, was Blackjack Harrison himself. Thomas remembered the Outlaws' words from their first encounter. You can't build anything that'll bury who you really are. This wasn't just about revenge or territory. Blackjack was trying to prove a point, that men like them couldn't change, couldn't build anything lasting. That violence was the only true constant in their world. A shot rang out from the schoolhouse window. Billy Thompson taking position, exactly where Thomas had taught him about sightlines and cover. The boy was a quick study, but he was still just a boy, alone against experienced killers. Thomas had a choice to make. He could ride for the town center, help the defenders push back the main assault. Or he could head for the schoolhouse, possibly saving Billy, but leaving the town vulnerable, unless he turned his horse toward the livery stable at the edge of town. Blackjack's men had positioned shooters to watch all the main streets, but they'd forgotten something important, something only a carpenter would know. The new drainage system Thomas had designed ran beneath the streets, connecting to the old silver mine tunnels that honeycombed the area. He'd insisted on mapping them all before starting construction, worried about cave-ins. Now, those same tunnels might just save the town. He dismounted at the stable's back entrance, moving quickly to the trapdoor hidden beneath fresh straw. As he lifted it, a voice spoke from the shadows. I wondered if you'd figure it out. Sarah Collins stepped forward, a Henry rifle in her hands. Charles is coordinating the defense in town. We've been holding them off, but they keep pressing closer. Blackjack's working his way to the schoolhouse. Thomas said, checking his guns. "The town's just a diversion." Sarah's expression hardened. "Because that's what you built, what you're most proud of. It's not about pride anymore." Thomas met her eyes. "Your brother died because of pride, his and mine. This is about something else." Redemption? Maybe. Or maybe just choosing what's worth fighting for. He gestured to the trapdoor. "These tunnels run under the whole town. We can move men into position without being seen, hit them from below." Sarah nodded, her earlier hostility fading. "I'll get word to Charles. How many men do you need?" "I'll get word to Charles. How many men do you need?" "Just one." Thomas checked his father's watch. High noon approaching. "Get everyone else to the church. When you hear 3 shots, have them push back hard against the main force. You're going after Blackjack alone. That's suicide, Mason." Sarah's voice carried an edge of frustration. James thought the same way, that he could handle everything alone. That's what got him killed. Thomas paused at the tunnel entrance. "Your brother died because he was trying to prove something. I'm trying to prevent something. There's a difference. And what about Billy? The boy worships you, follows you around like a shadow. What happens to him if you die playing the hero? That's why I need you to get him out of that schoolhouse." Thomas checked his guns one final time. "Billy's smart, but he's not ready for this kind of fight." "Not yet." Sarah studied him for a moment. "You've been teaching him, haven't you?" "Not just carpentry. How to shoot straight. How to read signs, things a boy should know out here." He met her gaze. "Things your brother should have learned before challenging a man like me." The words hung between them, heavy with shared regret. Finally, Sarah nodded. "I'll get him out. But Mason, when this is over, we need to talk about James, about what really happened that day. If we survive this, I'll tell you everything." He gestured to the tunnel entrance. "The south passage will take you right to the schoolhouse cellar. Stay low, stay quiet." As Sarah prepared to leave, she paused. "You know, when Charles and I came here, I wanted justice, or maybe revenge. Now," she shouldered her rifle, "now I just want to save this town you've built. Maybe that's justice enough." Thomas watched her disappear into the darkness before entering his own tunnel. The underground passages were a maze, but he'd mapped every inch during construction. Blackjack's men would be watching the streets, the rooftops, anywhere a man might approach from. They wouldn't be expecting an attack from below. He moved carefully, years of tracking experience helping him place each step silently, despite the loose gravel underfoot. The sounds of battle above grew louder as he approached the town center. He could make out individual voices now, shouts, commands, the occasional cry of pain. A familiar voice carried down through a ventilation shaft. "Keep them pinned down. When Harrison gives the signal, we burn it all." Rattler. Still alive despite their last encounter, Thomas marked his position mentally. The man would have to be dealt with before this was over. He reached a junction where the tunnel branched 3 ways. The left passage led toward the church, the right toward the schoolhouse. The center path. Thomas smiled grimly. The center path led to something Blackjack didn't know existed. During construction of the new water system, they discovered an old mining storage room, perfectly preserved. Thomas had reinforced it, added support beams, thinking it might make a good root cellar for the town. Now it would serve a different purpose. He moved quickly but quietly, counting his steps, 20 paces to the first support beam he'd installed, another 15 to the room itself. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it, including the carefully arranged barrels of blasting powder left over from the mining days. Thomas had learned more than just carpentry in the past 5 years. He'd studied engineering, learned about load-bearing walls and explosive force. Now, he began setting charges with precise care, using skills from both his old life and his new one. Above, the battle continued to rage. Through another ventilation shaft, He heard Billy's voice. "I see them, Miss Sarah. They're trying to circle around back. Stay down." Sarah's response was firm. "We're getting out of here just like Marshal Mason ordered." Good. Sarah would get Billy to safety. One less worry as he prepared to spring his trap. The final charge in place. Thomas checked his father's watch again. 5 minutes to noon. Luck. Jack was a man who appreciated symbolism. He'd make his move at the top of the hour, just like in the stories they told about him. "Your pa was right about one thing," Thomas muttered, remembering his father's words. "A man needs to know when to stand and when to walk away." He adjusted the final fuse. "But sometimes standing means making sure your enemy can't follow." He began making his way toward the schoolhouse tunnel, moving faster now. The charges were set on a 5-minute fuse. When they blew, they'd collapse key sections of the tunnel network, cutting off Blackjack's men from their escape routes and creating chaos in their ranks. But first, he had to reach the schoolhouse, had to face Blackjack one final time, had to prove that a man really could change, not by running from his past, but by using it to protect what he'd built. The distant church bell began to toll at noon as Thomas Mason moved through the darkness. Beneath his town, ready to show Blackjack Harrison exactly what kind of man a Carpenter could be. The final toll of the church bell echoed through Shadow Creek as Thomas Mason emerged from the tunnel into the schoolhouse cellar. The air was thick with dust and gun smoke, and somewhere above he could hear Blackjack's men moving into position. He checked his father's watch one last time before tucking it away. 4 minutes until the charges blew. 4 minutes to end this. The cellar stairs creaked softly as he ascended, his boots finding the reinforced spots he'd built into each step. Near the top, he paused, listening. 2 sets of boots moving across the schoolhouse floor, one heavy, one lighter. Blackjack and probably Rattler, judging by the uneven gait of the second man. "Empty," Rattler's voice confirmed. "The kid and the woman cleared out. They'll be back." Blackjack's tone was confident. "Mason's too predictable. He'll come for the schoolhouse. It's his pride and joy." A pause, followed by the sound of something being dragged. "Get those barrels in position. When he shows, we'll burn it all down around him." Thomas smiled grimly. Even now, Blackjack was underestimating him. The outlaw was thinking like a destroyer, not a builder. He didn't understand that knowing how to construct something meant knowing all its secrets, including the loose floorboard that Thomas had deliberately left near the teacher's desk. With practiced silence, he eased the board aside and peered through the gap. Blackjack stood by the window, his black duster catching the noon light. Rattler was arranging kerosene barrels near the walls, positioning them for maximum damage. Neither man was looking down. Thomas drew his gun with his right, and while his left found the support beam he'd built into the wall. 3 quick taps, a signal he'd arranged with Sarah. If she'd gotten his message to the others, they'd be ready. "You know what I've been wondering, Harrison?" Thomas called out, his voice carrying clearly through the floorboards. Both men spun around, guns appearing in their hands. "Mason?" Blackjack's eyes darted around the room. "Show yourself!" "I've been wondering why a man like you, successful outlaw, feared gunslinger, would care so much about one small-town carpenter." Thomas shifted position silently as he spoke, using his voice to keep their attention. "Seems like an awful lot of effort just for revenge. Maybe I just don't like pretenders," Blackjack snarled, still trying to locate the source of Thomas's voice. "Men who think they can walk away from what they are. Or maybe," Thomas continued, "you're afraid. Afraid that if one man can change, can build something good, then all your excuses for being what you are start to fall apart." Rattler moved toward the sound, but Blackjack held up a hand to stop him. "Pretty words from a man hiding in the shadows. The Mason I knew would have faced me straight on. The Mason you knew would have kicked in that door and tried to outshoot you both." Thomas smiled, though they couldn't see it. "But I'm not just a gunfighter anymore. I'm a builder. And a good builder always checks the foundation first. Right. On cue, the first charge detonated. The explosion wasn't massive, but it didn't need to be. The carefully placed powder collapsed a key section of the tunnel, sending vibrations through the town's underground network. Blackjack and Rattler staggered as the floor shifted beneath them. Thomas burst up through the loose floorboard in the same instant, his first shot catching Rattler's gun hand. The man's weapon went flying as he stumbled back, clutching his bleeding fingers. Blackjack recovered faster, snapping off a shot that splintered the wood where Thomas had been a moment before. But the carpenter-turned-marshal was already moving, rolling behind the teacher's desk he'd built extra thick for just such a purpose. "You see?" Blackjack laughed, the sound nearly drowned out by the second explosion rumbling beneath the town. "All that talk about building, and here you are, shooting like old times." "Look again," Thomas called back. "I haven't killed anyone yet. That was always the difference between us, Harrison. I only kill when I have to. Then you'll have to kill." "Me," Blackjack snarled, firing again, "because I'm not stopping until this whole town burns." The third charge detonated, more distant, but still powerful enough to rattle the windows. "Right on schedule. 3 explosions," Thomas said calmly. "Just like 3 shots. That was the signal." From outside came the sudden roar of gunfire. But not from Blackjack's men. The townspeople, led by Charles Collins and Sheriff Parker, had been waiting for this moment. The defenders surged forward from their positions, catching the outlaws between hammer and anvil. Blackjack's face contorted with rage as he realized the trap. "Rattler! The barrels! Burn it now!" "I wouldn't." Thomas's voice carried a quiet certainty. "Those barrels are filled with water! And the real detonation charges are under your men's positions in town." "What?" Both outlaws turned to stare at the containers. "Changed them last night, before I rode out." Thomas stood slowly, his gun steady. "Had a feeling you'd try something like this. You see, Harrison, that's the difference between us. You think like a destroyer, looking for what you can burn down. I think like a builder, always planning 3 steps ahead." "Always so righteous," Blackjack sneered. "Tell me, Mason, did you plan 3 steps ahead in Dodge City when young Mackenzie called you out?" Thomas's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That was different, was it? Or did you just tell yourself to sleep better at night?" Jack moved slightly, positioning himself better. "I talked to the kid's friends before he died. Know what they told me? Said he practiced for weeks before calling you out. Said he wanted to prove himself worthy of his father's name, the father you gunned down. I gave his father every chance. To walk away? Like you're giving me now?" Blackjack laughed harshly. "When are you going to admit it, Mason? The reason you became so famous, the reason they called you 3-Shot Mason, wasn't because you were the fastest. It was because you were the coldest. 3 shots, precise as clockwork. Never more, never less. Like you were building something with bullets instead of nails." Blackjack's eyes narrowed. "Still 2 of us, Mason. Even with a wounded hand, Rattler's faster than most men." "True," Thomas agreed. "But you're forgetting something important." "What's that?" "I built this place." Thomas's foot touched a hidden lever in the floorboard. "Every inch of it." The trapdoor beneath Rattler's feet suddenly gave way, dropping the startled gunman into the cellar. The sound of his landing was followed by a grunt and the distinct click of Sarah Collins's rifle being cocked. "Just you and me now, Harrison," Thomas said quietly. "Like you wanted." Blackjack's smile was razor-sharp. "Perfect." His hand dropped to his gun. "Let's see if the carpenter remembers his old trade. Last chance to walk away. You know better." Blackjack's eyes glittered. "Men like us don't walk away. We just find new lies to tell ourselves." The outlaw's draw was blindingly fast, as quick as Thomas remembered, maybe quicker. The gun seemed to materialize in his hand, flame blooming from the barrel. But Thomas Mason hadn't survived all those years as a gunfighter by being slow. 3. Shots rang out distinct and precise. Blackjack's gun went spinning away, a neat hole drilled through the cylinder. His gun belt fell, severed by the second shot, and his hat lifted off his head, a third hole punched clean through the brim. 3 shots, Thomas said softly, just like always. 1 to disarm, 1 to disable, 1 to remind. Blackjack stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. Impossible. Nobody's that fast. Not anymore, not after 5 years of sawdust and nails. You want to know something interesting about carpentry? Thomas kept his gun trained on the outlaw as he approached. It teaches you that precision matters more than speed, that doing something right is better than doing it fast. He smiled slightly, and that practice, day after day, builds muscles. You didn't even know you had. From outside came the sound of victory shouts. The townspeople had routed Blackjack's men, driving them into the waiting arms of Sheriff Parker's deputies. "It's over, Harrison. Your men are done. The Vasquez brothers will hang when McGraw's testimony reaches the federal judge." Thomas produced a pair of handcuffs. "Time to face justice." "Justice?" Blackjack laughed bitterly. "There's no justice for men like us, Mason. Just different kinds of cages we build for ourselves." "Maybe." Thomas secured the cuffs with practiced ease. "But I'd rather build a life than a legend, and I'd rather bring you in alive than add another ghost to my collection." As he led Blackjack out into the sunlight, the full extent of the battle's aftermath became clear. Several buildings were scorched, but standing. Charles Collins was organizing men to put out the remaining fires, while Sarah tended to the wounded, alongside Emma Sullivan. Manuel Vasquez and his companion were nowhere to be seen, likely riding hard for the border with news of their operation's collapse. The townspeople gathered, watching as Thomas marched his prisoner down the street. Some faces showed relief, others awe, but a few, the older ones who'd seen their share of violence, showed understanding. They recognized what it had cost him to return to his old ways, even for a just cause. "You did good, Mr. Mason." "Billy," Thompson called out, starting forward, but his father caught his shoulder. "Hold up there, son," Thompson said quietly. "Let the marshal finish his business first." Thomas appreciated the man's discretion. There was a darkness that came with violence, even necessary violence, and he didn't want Billy too close to it. Right now, the boy had seen enough today. "Sheriff," Thomas called to Parker, "got some trash that needs collecting." Parker stepped forward with iron handcuffs. "With pleasure, Marshal." He began securing Blackjack, then paused. "You know, Harrison, I served with a man named Mackenzie in the war. Good man, principled, nothing like the picture you painted of his son." Blackjack's eyes narrowed. "What's your point?" "My point is, some men use their father's legacies as an excuse for violence. Others, like young James Mackenzie, try to live. Up to them, and a few," he glanced at Thomas, "learn to build something new from them." Sarah Collins approached as Parker led Blackjack away. She carried her Henry rifle with the confidence of someone who'd found their own kind of peace. "You could have killed him," she said quietly to Thomas. "After what he said about James, about your past, no one would have blamed you." "That's exactly why I didn't." Thomas finally holstered his gun. 5 years ago I would have, because it was expected, because it was easier." He looked at the schoolhouse, scarred but standing. But easy isn't always right. Emma Sullivan waited on the schoolhouse steps, Billy Thompson beside her. The boy's eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and understanding as he watched Thomas lead Blackjack away. "Mr. Mason," Billy called out, "is it really over?" Thomas nodded. "It's over. Town's safe." He looked at Emma. "Time to get back to building." She smiled, understanding all that he wasn't saying. "The school still needs its roof, and I've got a letter to discuss with you," Thomas added quietly. Blackjack made a disgusted sound. "Still pretending, Mason? Playing at normal life?" "Not pretending." Thomas turned to his prisoner. "Just choosing. Every day we choose what kind of man to be. Today I chose to be both, the shooter and the builder, because sometimes, he glanced at Billy, the best lesson you can teach is that a man doesn't have to be only one thing. As Sheriff Parker's men led Blackjack away, Thomas looked at his schoolhouse, scarred but standing, like the town, like himself. "Now then," Thomas said, looking at his schoolhouse, "who's ready to help raise that roof?" "I am!" Billy stepped forward eagerly, then remembered himself. If that's still allowed, Mr. Mason, after everything that happened." Thomas knelt down to the boy's level. "Billy, remember what I told you about building? About how every beam, every nail has its purpose?" "Yes, sir. You said the strongest buildings are the ones where everything works together." "That's right." Thomas smiled. "Same goes for towns, for people." "What happened today?" "The fighting, the shooting, that was about protecting what we've built. But the real work, the important work," he gestured to the schoolhouse, "that's still ahead of us." Emma Sullivan approached, carrying Thomas's carpenter's apron. "Found this in the cellar," she said softly. "Thought you might need it." As Thomas stood to accept it, their hands touched briefly. Something passed between them, an understanding, a promise of conversations yet to come. "You know," she said, "most men would be celebrating right now, trading stories about the famous three-shot Mason's return. Most men didn't spend 5 years learning that some things are worth more than reputation." Thomas donned the apron, feeling its familiar weight. "Besides, that roof won't build itself." Charles Collins emerged from the schoolhouse where he'd been examining the damage. "Structure's sound," he reported. "Your workmanship held up, even with all the shooting and explosions." "Course it did," Billy said proudly. "Mr. Mason built it." Sarah Collins joined them, her rifle now slung over her shoulder. "You know, Thomas, there's still a federal marshal's badge pinned to your vest. The territory could use a man who knows how to build things up instead of just tearing them down." Thomas touched the badge thoughtfully. "Maybe, but right now, this town needs a carpenter more than it needs a lawman." He looked at the gathering crowd of townspeople, saw their mix of respect and acceptance. Although, maybe it's possible to be both, to build with one hand and protect with the other. "Like you said," Emma reminded him, "a man doesn't have to be only one thing." The sun was setting over Shadow Creek, painting the sky in shades of promise. Thomas Mason picked up his hammer, feeling the perfect balance of its weight. Around him, townspeople were already gathering lumber, ready to help rebuild what the battle had damaged. He looked at Billy Thompson, saw the hope in the boy's eyes, looked at Emma Sullivan, saw the future in her smile, looked at Sarah Collins and saw not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. The ghost of James Mackenzie would always be with him, along with all the others. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe those ghosts were like the foundation of a building, not something to run from, but something to build upon, to build over, to build better. "All right then," he called out to the waiting townspeople. "Let's get to work. Daylight's wasting, and we've got ourselves a school to finish." As the sounds of construction began to fill the air, replacing the echoes of gunfire, Thomas Mason smiled. Three-shot Mason might not be completely gone, but he wasn't in control anymore. The builder was, and there was still so much left to build. Dawn broke over Shadow Creek 2 days after the battle, finding Thomas Mason already at work on the schoolhouse roof. The rhythmic sound of his hammer echoed through the quiet streets, a counterpoint to the morning bird song. Below, Billy Thompson sorted nails with careful attention, just as Thomas had taught him. The boy hadn't left the carpenter's side since. The fighting ended, as if afraid his mentor might disappear again. "Mr. Mason," Billy called up. "Riders coming." Thomas paused his work, noting the tension in Billy's voice. But these weren't outlaws or bounty hunters approaching. The small group of horsemen wore the distinctive badges of federal marshals, led by a familiar face, Judge Isaiah Morton, the circuit court justice known for his unflinching integrity. "Marshal Mason," the judge called out as they drew near. "Or do you prefer Mr. Mason these days?" Thomas descended from the roof, wiping sawdust from his hands. "Just Thomas is fine, Your Honor. Wasn't expecting to see you so soon." Word travels fast when three-shot Mason comes out of retirement. Morton dismounted with the stiffness of age, especially when he does it wearing a federal badge. "About that badge," Thomas began, but Morton waved him off. "Charles Collins telegraphed me the full report. Blackjack Harrison and his men in custody, the Vasquez gun-running operation exposed, McGraw's confession about the murder of Swift Arrow." The judge's eyes were sharp beneath his bushy brows. "Quite a piece of work, Thomas. The territory owes. You a debt?" "Town did most of the fighting," Thomas deflected. "I just helped coordinate, and that's exactly why I'm here." Morton gestured to his companions. "These men aren't just my escort. They're here to offer you a permanent position." Thomas frowned. "I've got work here, Your Honor. The school will get built," Morton finished. "But think about what else you could build, Thomas. The territory's changing, the old ways, solving everything with guns and violence. They're dying out. We need men who understand that, men who know how to build communities, not just enforce laws. What exactly are you proposing? A new kind of marshal's office, one that focuses on prevention rather than punishment, teaching towns to defend themselves, helping them build proper institutions." Morton smiled slightly. "The kind of work you've already been doing here in Shadow Creek." From the saloon doorway, Emma Sullivan appeared, carrying a tray of coffee. She'd taken to bringing refreshments to the construction site each morning, though Thomas suspected it wasn't just the workers she was interested in checking on. "Morning, Emma." Morton tipped his hat. "Still making the best coffee west of the Mississippi, I see." "Judge Morton," she smiled. "Will you be staying for the town council meeting? We're discussing plans for expanding the school program." "Wouldn't miss it." The judge accepted the cup gratefully. "In fact, that's partly why I'm here. The territory's setting up a fund for frontier education. Towns with proper schools get priority for law enforcement support, infrastructure improvements." Thomas's hands stilled on his hammer. "That's why you want me, not for my gun, but for this." Morton gestured at the half-finished schoolhouse. "For knowing how to build something that lasts. The gun skills, they're just a tool like that hammer of yours. It's what you choose to do with them that matters." Sarah Collins approached, led by the sound of voices. She'd been staying in town, helping organize the school curriculum while Charles handled the legal proceedings against Blackjack's captured men. "Judge Morton," she greeted, "I hope you're not trying to steal our Carpenter away." "Not steal, Mrs. Collins. Expand his territory." Morton turned back to Thomas. "You'd still be based here in Shadow Creek, but you'd have the authority and resources to help other towns follow your example. Build schools, train local law enforcement, establish proper civic institutions." Billy looked up from his nail sorting, his young face worried. "But he'd still teach me carpentry, right?" "And other things," Thomas said quietly, meeting the boys' eyes. "Remember what I said about a man being more than one thing?" Billy nodded slowly. "Like being a builder and a protector?" "Exactly." Thomas turned to Morton. "I'll need to think about it, Your Honor. Discuss it with some people." "Of course." The judge handed him a thick envelope. "Here's the formal offer, along with details about the program. But there's something else you should know." His expression grew serious. "Manuel Vasquez crossed the border yesterday. His contacts in Mexico are already spreading word, offering rewards for anyone who can hurt you where you live. By targeting the town," Thomas concluded grimly. "The school specifically," Morton confirmed. "Vasquez understands symbols, too. He knows what it means to you." Emma stepped closer to Thomas, her hand brushing his arm. "We're not afraid," she said firmly. This town stood together against Blackjack. We can stand against Vasquez too." "That's just it," Morton said. "In the old days, a town under threat would just hire guns to protect it, but you've shown there's another way, building something strong enough to withstand the storm." He smiled at Emma. "Though I suspect some of us have additional reasons for wanting you to stay." Thomas felt Emma's hand tighten slightly on his arm. They hadn't discussed what was growing between them, hadn't had time with all the repair work needed. But it was there, as solid as the schoolhouse foundations. "There's something else," Sarah added. "Charles and we've been talking about staying on, making Shadow Creek our home." She met Thomas's eyes. "James would have wanted that, I think, to see something good grow from all the pain." The morning sun had climbed higher, illuminating the schoolhouse's unfinished frame. Thomas looked at his work, the solid joints, the careful angles, each piece fitted exactly where it needed to be. Just like the town itself, it was a work in progress. But the foundation was strong. "Billy," he called, "remember what I taught you about building a roof?" The boy straightened proudly. "Yes, sir. Start from the bottom, work your way up. Make sure each row is true before moving to the next." "That's right. And what happens if you try to rush it?" "The whole thing comes down," Billy recited, "because every piece depends on the ones below it." Thomas nodded. "Same principle applies to building a territory. Can't rush it, can't skip steps." He turned to Morton. "If I take this position, I will do it my way. No compromises." "That's exactly why we want you," Morton replied. "You understand that law and order isn't just about having the fastest gun. It's about building something people believe in, something they'll fight to protect." The sound of hammering from other parts of town carried on the morning air, people repairing damage from the battle, making improvements while they were at it. Shadow Creek was growing, changing, just like the territory itself. "I'll need deputies," Thomas said thoughtfully, "people who understand both sides of the job." "Already thought of that," Morton smiled. "Sheriff Parker recommended some names, and young Billy there seems to have a knack for both carpentry and keeping watch." Billy's eyes widened. "Really, Mr. Mason? You'd teach me both? If your parents agree." Thomas ruffled the boy's hair. "Every good builder needs an apprentice, and every good lawman needs someone to remind him what he's fighting for." Emma stepped forward. "And what about those of us who need something else from you?" Thomas met her gaze. "I reckon a man who can be both builder and lawman might find time to be something else too, if he's got the right motivation." Judge Morton cleared his throat. "Well, I should see about getting settled at the hotel. Town council meetings at noon, I believe." He gathered his reins. "Think about the offer, Thomas. Territory's changing. Men like Blackjack, they're the past. We need people who can help build the future." As the judge and his escorts rode toward the hotel, Thomas turned back to his work. But now he saw it differently, not just as a schoolhouse, but as a symbol of what was possible. A place where children could learn both arithmetic and courage, where the sons of settlers and lawmen alike could become something more than their fathers. "Billy," he called, "bring up that next beam. Time to show you how to frame a roof that'll last for generations." The boy scrambled up the ladder, eager to learn. Below, Emma and Sarah exchanged knowing looks before heading off to their own tasks. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that Thomas Mason had finally found his true calling. Not as a gunfighter who tried to build, but as a builder who knew how to fight when building wasn't enough. The morning sun climbed higher over Shadow Creek, promising another day of work, growth, and possibility. And if there were dark clouds on the horizon, Vasquez and his Mexican connections, other threats yet unknown, well, that was all the more reason to build something strong. After all, the strongest structures were the ones built knowing they'd have to weather storms. The town council meeting was held in the newly repaired church, sunlight streaming through windows that still showed traces of gun smoke. Thomas sat near the back, more comfortable with his hammer than politics, but Emma had insisted he attend. The territorial grant would cover expansion of the school, Charles Collins was explaining, pointing to architectural drawings spread across a makeshift table. 2 more classrooms, proper facilities for 100 students. 100 students? Someone scoffed. Town's not big enough for that. It will be, Judge Morton interjected. Railroad's coming through next spring. Shadow Creek's position makes it a natural hub for the new line. Thomas straightened at this news. A railroad meant growth opportunities and complications. More people meant more potential threats, more challenges to the peace they'd built. Which is why, Morton continued, Marshal Mason's new position is so crucial. Shadow Creek will be a model for other frontier towns, showing how education and law enforcement can work together to build civilization. Sarah Collins stood, her voice carrying the authority of her Eastern education. We've already seen the benefits. During the recent unpleasantness, it was the school children who organized the bucket brigades, kept the fires from spreading, because they'd learned about town planning, about working together. Thomas smiled slightly, remembering Billy Thompson directing his friends with the same precision he used sorting nails. The boy had taken his lessons to heart, both the carpentry and the larger principles behind it. There's another matter we need to discuss, Sheriff Parker spoke up. Got word this morning about Manuel Vasquez. He's been meeting with other border gangs, trying to build a coalition. They're calling it the Frontier Alliance. A murmur ran through the crowd. Everyone knew what that meant. Vasquez was gathering an army bigger than anything Blackjack had managed. Let them come, someone called out. Town held together once. We can do it again. It's not that simple, Thomas said quietly, but his voice carried in the sudden silence. Vasquez isn't Blackjack. He doesn't want to destroy the town. He wants to own it. Control the railroad, control the territory. Emma turned in her seat to face him. Then we'll stop him, together like before. No. Thomas stood, addressing the whole room now. This time, we need to be smarter. Vasquez thinks like a businessman. He'll target our weaknesses, supply lines, trade routes, try to strangle the town slowly. Judge Morton nodded approvingly. Which is why we need more than just guns. We need infrastructure, organization, the kind of strength that comes from building something lasting. School is just the start, Charles added. With the territorial grant, we can expand the water system, improve the roads, make Shadow Creek too valuable to attack. Thomas moved to the architectural drawings, his builder's eye analyzing the plans. These walls are good, but they could be better. Reinforced corners here and here. He marked the changes. Windows positioned for clear lines of sight. Make the whole building defensible without looking like a fort. Teaching and protecting at the same time, Sarah mused. Just like you. A knock at the church door interrupted them. Billy Thompson burst in, out of breath from running. Mr. Mason, riders coming in from the south, looked like Mexican bandits. The room erupted in concerned murmurs, but Thomas held up a hand for quiet. How many, Billy? Just 3, but they're carrying a white flag. Thomas exchanged glances with Sheriff Parker and Judge Morton. Vasquez making his first move. Could be a trap, Parker warned. Could be an opportunity, Morton countered. If they're here to negotiate, they're here to test us, Thomas said firmly, to see how we respond to a peaceful approach. He checked his gun out of habit, then deliberately removed the gun belt. So let's show them something they don't expect. Emma caught his arm as he headed for the door. Thomas, you're not going. Out there unarmed? He smiled slightly. I'm not unarmed, Emma. I've got the whole town behind me. In a lower voice he added, but have Billy get up in the bell tower with his father's spyglass. Just in case. The Mexican riders had stopped at the edge of town, their white flag prominent. Thomas walked out to meet them, aware of the watching eyes from every window and doorway. He carried his carpenter's hammer, using it like a walking stick. The lead rider was young, barely more than a boy, but he sat on his horse with the confidence of someone used to violence. "You are Mason? Three-shot Mason?" "I'm Thomas Mason," he replied calmly, "builder of schools and enforcer of laws. Something I can help you with?" The young Mexican's eyes narrowed at the casual tone. "I bring message from Señor Vasquez. He says to tell you war is bad for business. Perhaps we can find arrangement?" "Already got an arrangement," Thomas said. "It's called the law. Your boss is welcome to operate within it." "The law?" The rider laughed. "Law is for those who cannot take what they want. Señor Vasquez, he offers partnership, share in the railroad profits, the trade routes. All you must do is step aside." Thomas pretended to consider this. "Interesting offer. Mind if I show you something while I think it over?" Without waiting for a response, he turned and pointed with his hammer. "See that schoolhouse there? Built it with these hands. Every beam, every nail placed just so." He moved the hammer slightly. "And that church? Reinforced the walls myself after your friend. Blackjack's attack. Know what I learned doing that work?" The riders shifted uneasily, thrown off by his casual manner, learned that anything worth building is worth protecting. Thomas's voice hardened slightly. "Learned that a man who builds something sees all its strengths, all its weaknesses, knows exactly where to place the weight to make it stand or to make it fall. Is that a threat, Mason?" "Just an observation." Thomas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You tell Vasquez I appreciate his offer, but Shadow Creek isn't for sale or partnership. He wants to do business here. He does it legally. He wants to fight." The smile vanished. "Well, I've learned a thing or two about building defenses." The lead rider started to speak, but movement caught his eye. Billy Thompson had appeared in the bell tower, mirror flashing as he pretended to signal unseen watchers. On the church steps, Emma Sullivan stood with her shotgun, Sarah Collins beside her with the Henry rifle. And all around, townspeople had emerged, carrying not just guns but tools, hammers, axes, implements of buildings that could easily become weapons. "Quite an army you have, Mason," the rider observed nervously. "Not an army, a community. There's a difference." Thomas turned, his hammer over in his hands. "Something else I learned building this town. Everyone has a stake in protecting what they helped create." He stepped closer to the riders, his voice dropping. "One last thing. Tell Vasquez that if he's serious about negotiating, he should come himself next time, not send boys to do a man's work." The young Mexican's face flushed with anger, but he controlled himself. Without another word, he wheeled his horse around and the riders galloped away. Thomas watched them go, then turned back to the town. Emma met him halfway, concern mixed with admiration in her eyes. "That was quite a performance," she said softly, "but you just painted a target on yourself." "Target was already there," he replied. "Just made sure they know hitting it won't be easy." He looked at the schoolhouse, still under construction. "Besides, some things are worth the risk." Judge Morton approached, nodding approvingly. "Well handled, Marshal. Showed strength without escalation." He gestured to the church. "Shall we continue our meeting? Seems we have some additional planning to discuss." As they headed back inside, Billy called down from the bell tower, "Mr. Mason, can I come help with the planning?" Thomas smiled up at his young apprentice. "Come on down, Billy. Future's going to need builders and watchers both. Might as well start learning now." The morning sun climbed higher over Shadow Creek, glinting off windows and tools alike. Thomas Mason walked back to the church, his hammer in his hand, his gun safely in the office. He'd meant what he said to the riders. He wasn't just a shooter anymore, or even just a builder. He was becoming something new, something the frontier hadn't seen before. A man who could raise walls and defend them, who could teach peace while preparing for war. A man who understood that the strongest defenses weren't built of wood or stone, but of community and purpose. And if Vasquez wanted to test that strength, well, Thomas smiled grimly. Some lessons had to be taught the hard way. 2 weeks after the Mexican rider's visit, Thomas stood in his workshop behind the schoolhouse, carefully shaping a piece of oak. The emerging gun stock took form under his skilled hands, each stroke of the plane precise and purposeful. "Didn't know you made weapons too." Emma's voice came from the doorway. She carried her usual morning coffee, but her expression was troubled. "Not weapons," Thomas corrected softly. "Tools, for the new deputies." He held up the stock, showing the subtle curves. A well-made rifle is like a well-made beam, has to be strong in the right places, balanced just so. She set down the coffee and moved closer, watching him work. "More riders came in last night. Sheriff Parker said they were watching the South Road, checking our defenses." "I know." Thomas blew sawdust from the wood grain. "Billy's father counted. 4 of them from the bell tower. They're getting bolder, or more desperate." Emma's hand touched his arm, stealing his work. "Thomas, there's something you need to know. The supply wagon from Mesa Rouge was robbed yesterday. 3rd one this month." He set down his tools carefully. "Anyone hurt?" "No, but the driver said the bandits knew exactly what they were looking for. Building materials, ammunition, even the school books we ordered." Her voice hardened. "Vasquez is trying to strangle us, just like you predicted." "He's doing more than that." Thomas moved to his workbench, unrolling a map he'd been annotating. "Look here, every raid, every sighting forms a pattern. He's not just cutting supply lines, he's isolating us, making sure we can't get help when the real attack comes." Emma studied the map, her quick mind grasping the strategy. "The railroad survey team arrives next week. If they decide Shadow Creek's too dangerous, the line goes elsewhere, and the town dies on the vine." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Vasquez doesn't need to burn us out. He just needs to make us look like a bad investment." A knock at the workshop door interrupted them. Sarah Collins entered, followed by her husband and Judge Morton. Charles carried a stack of papers that Thomas recognized as legal documents. "We've got a problem," Charles announced without preamble. "Just got word from the territorial capital. Someone's challenging the land grants for the school expansion." Morton nodded grimly. "Vasquez has friends in high places. They're claiming the territorial charter wasn't properly filed." "Can they do that?" Emma demanded. "They can tie it up in court for months," Charles replied. "Long enough to delay construction until winter, long enough to miss the railroad's deadline." Thomas turned back to his workbench, running his fingers over the half-finished gunstock. "So that's his game. Use the law against us, just like I used it against him." "There's more," Sarah added. "The children from the outlying farms. Their parents are talking about sending them to Mesa Rouge for schooling. They're scared, Thomas, scared of what's coming." The morning sun streamed through the workshop windows, catching dust motes and highlighting the projects in various stages of completion. Gunstocks, furniture for the school, repair work for the town. All of it building towards something larger. Something Vasquez was trying to tear down without firing a shot. "He won't succeed," Thomas said quietly, but with iron certainty. "Shadow Creek is stronger than he thinks." "Strength might not be enough this time," Morton warned. "We need a plan." Something that the judge trailed off as Billy Thompson burst into the workshop, his young face flushed with excitement. Mr. Mason, you've got to come quick." "There's a lady asking for you in the saloon," Thomas frowned. "A lady? She's from Dodge City." Billy's eyes were wide. "Says she's James Mackenzie's widow." The adults exchanged startled looks. Sarah's hand went to her throat, and Emma's grip tightened on Thomas's arm. "Catherine Mackenzie," Sarah whispered. "Here." Thomas's mind raced back 5 years to that terrible day in Dodge. The young widow's face as she cradled her dead husband, her eyes burning with grief and hatred. He'd never expected to see her again, had carried that guilt alongside all his others. Did she say what she wants? he asked Billy. The boy shook his head. Just that it's important. Something about proof against Vasquez. Thomas met Emma's concerned gaze, then looked at the others. They all knew what this could mean, either salvation or destruction, depending on Catherine Mackenzie's motives. Well, he said finally, reaching for his coat, it seems we've got a visitor to greet. Thomas, Emma's voice stopped him. Your gun. He looked at his gun belt, hanging on its peg beside his carpenter's apron. After a moment's consideration, he took the apron instead. If she's here for revenge, he said quietly, a gun won't help. And if she's here to help, he managed a small smile. Better she sees who I am now, not who I was then. The walk to the saloon seemed longer than usual. People stopped their morning routines to watch, word of Catherine Mackenzie's arrival spreading, faster than a prairie fire. By the time they reached the saloon's swinging doors, half the town seemed to be finding excuses to be nearby. Inside, the morning light filtered through dusty windows, illuminating a woman seated at a corner table. She was younger than Thomas, remembered, or maybe grief had aged her more that day in Dodge. Her black dress was travel-stained but elegant, and her face showed none of the hatred he'd expected. Marshal Mason, she said softly as they approached. Or is it just Mr. Mason now? I hear you've turned to more constructive pursuits. Just Thomas will do, Mrs. Mackenzie. Mrs. Collins now, she corrected. Life moves on, doesn't it? Even when we think it never can. Emma stepped forward. I'm Emma Sullivan. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Catherine smiled slightly. Thank you, no. I won't be staying long. She opened a small valise on the table. I came because I owe a debt, not to you, Marshal Mason, but to justice itself. From the valise, she withdrew a packet of letters. These belong to James. I found them after Dodge City, their correspondence between him and Manuel Vasquez, dating back 2 years before the shooting. Thomas took the letters carefully, aware of Charles Collins reading over his shoulder. The implications were clear. James Mackenzie had been working with Vasquez even then, perhaps setting up Thomas for ambush. Why? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would James involve himself with someone like Vasquez? Because Vasquez promised him revenge, Catherine replied, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. But it was more than that. James, he was always living in the shadows. His father's shadow, Marshal Mason's shadow, the shadow of his own fears. She withdrew more papers from her vaults. These are James's personal letters, his journal. I think you should read them, Miss Collins. Understand your brother as he really was. Sarah took the offered papers with trembling hands. Thomas watched as she read, seeing the play of emotions across her face. Grief, understanding, and finally, a kind of peace. He writes about you, Sarah said softly, looking up at Catherine. About how meeting you made him want to be better. But then Vasquez came. Vasquez has a gift for finding men's weaknesses, Catherine confirmed. He convinced James that becoming a killer was the only way to prove himself a man. That violence was strength. Her eyes met Thomas's. The same way he's trying to convince this territory that civilization can only come through force. Charles Collins studied the business letters intently. There's more here than just murder plots. Vasquez was building a network. Judges, politicians, businessmen, all of them compromised, all of them under his control. A web of corruption, Judge Morton mused, with Vasquez at the center, pulling strings we never saw. Thomas read through the letters quickly, his carpenter's eye noting details others might miss, paper types, ink patterns, the distinctive handwriting of a man he'd only known at the end of a gun. These prove Vasquez was organizing killings even back then, he said finally. Prove he's been manipulating events across the territory for years. Enough to avoid any legal challenges he makes against the town, Charles added excitedly. Enough to get federal authorities involved? Catherine stood, smoothing her skirts. That's why I brought them. Vasquez's men approached my new husband last month, trying to pressure him into supporting their railroad claims. Richard, my husband, is a federal judge now. Her smile turned hard. They didn't know who I was. Didn't know I'd been keeping these letters, waiting for the right moment. Why now? Thomas asked quietly. Why help us? Because I was wrong about you, Marshal Mason. Wrong about a lot of things. She glanced around the saloon, taking in the signs of civilization building out of the frontier chaos. James chose his path. He let hate consume him, let men like Vasquez use that hate. But you chose to build something instead of destroying. That's worth protecting. Emma stepped closer to Thomas, her presence supportive but marking territory. In a way Catherine couldn't miss. The widow's smile softened. Don't worry, Miss Sullivan. I'm not here to complicate anything. Just to make things right. She turned back to Thomas. Use the letters. Stop Vasquez. Build something my James never had the courage to imagine. As Catherine prepared to leave, Emma stepped forward. Wait, please. Would you stay for dinner? There's so much I'd like to ask you about James, about Dodge City. She glanced at Thomas. About how people can change. Catherine hesitated, then smiled softly. You love him, don't you? The way I loved James. Emma blushed slightly. I love who he is, all of who he is, the builder and the protector. Then you're wiser than I was, Catherine said. I only saw what James could be, not what he was becoming. She turned to Thomas. The night before the shooting, James wrote one last entry in his journal. He wrote that he finally understood what real strength was, but it was too late. His pride, his hate, wouldn't let him back down. Thomas absorbed this quietly. I tried to talk him down, told him there was always another choice. I know. I read the witness statements afterward. You gave him every chance. Catherine's voice caught slightly. That's why I had to come when I heard about Vasquez targeting Shadow Creek. Because you're building something my James died, trying to tear down. A future where strength comes from what you create, not what you destroy. The saloon doors swung shut behind her, leaving them with the letters and their implications. Charles was already sorting the documents into categories, his legal mind cataloguing the evidence they'd need. These business contracts, he mused, they're all linked to the railroad's proposed route. Vasquez wasn't just building a criminal empire, he was trying to control the territory's future development. Makes sense, Thomas said, studying the map on the wall. Railroad means civilization. Civilization means law and order. Everything Vasquez has been fighting against, not fighting against, Judge Morton corrected. Trying to control. He doesn't want to stop progress. He wants to own it, shape it in his image. Sarah looked up from James's journal, her eyes wet but clear. There's something else here. James writes about Vasquez's plans for Shadow Creek. Even back then, he saw this town as a symbol, the last real frontier settlement, the place where old ways and new would finally meet. And now we're building exactly what he feared, Emma added. A place where law comes from community, not force, where children learn alongside their parents, where, she smiled at Thomas, where a gunfighter can become a carpenter. Billy Thompson, who had been quietly listening from his corner, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Mason, does this mean Vasquez will come himself now? Not just send his men? Thomas knelt beside his young apprentice. What makes you think that, Billy? Well, the boy said thoughtfully, you always say to understand how something is built, you have to see it yourself. If Shadow Creek's really that important to him, Thomas smiled proudly. Good thinking. Yes, I expect Vasquez will come. He'll have to now. His careful plans are falling apart. Men like him, they can't stand to lose control. Then we'll be ready, Emma said firmly. The whole town working together. Thomas stood, looking around at these people who had become more than friends. They were his future, his redemption, his proof that change was possible. "Judge," he said finally, "get those letters to the territorial capital. Charles, Sarah. See what else you can learn from James's writings about Vasquez's operation. Emma." He smiled softly. "Keep me from doing anything foolish." "And me, Mr. Mason?" Billy asked eagerly. "You've got the most important job of all." Thomas ruffled the boy's hair. "Keep building, keep learning, keep showing everyone that the future belongs to those who know how to create, not destroy." As they dispersed to their tasks, Thomas lingered in the saloon, looking at the scaffold of the schoolhouse visible through the window. Catherine's visit had changed more than just their tactical situation. It had reminded him why this fight mattered. Shadow Creek wasn't just a town. It was proof that the West could be more than violence and vengeance, that men could change, that justice could come from building up rather than tearing down. And Thomas Mason, former gunfighter turned carpenter, was ready to defend that proof. With everything he had built, including himself, the morning Shadow Creek had been waiting for finally arrived with the first snow of winter. Thomas Mason stood at the schoolhouse window, watching white flakes settle on the newly completed roof. Behind him, children's voices recited their lessons under Emma Sullivan's guidance. "Mr. Mason!" Billy Thompson's urgent whisper came from the doorway. "Riders coming, lots of them." Thomas nodded calmly. They'd been expecting this since Judge Morton telegraphed 3 days ago that the federal warrants had been issued. Vasquez wouldn't wait for the law to catch up with him. "Get the children to the cellar," he told Emma quietly, "just like we practiced." She nodded, already shepherding her students toward the reinforced trapdoor. The past month had seen the entire town preparing, drilling evacuations, strengthening buildings, establishing fallback positions. They'd learned from the battle with Blackjack's gang. Outside, the winter wind carried the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Thomas moved to the schoolhouse steps, noting the defensive positions already being taken up around town. Sheriff Parker's, deputies on the rooftops, Charles Collins and his volunteers at the barricades, Sarah manning the telegraph office, ready to call for help from nearby settlements. Manuel Vasquez led his men into town like a general reviewing troops. His black coat was dusted with snow, and his customary elegant manner seemed stretched thin over barely contained rage. Behind him rode at least 40 men, a mixture of Mexican bandits and American outlaws. "Marshal Mason," Vasquez called out, reining in his horse. "Or should I say Carpenter? I find myself confused by your many roles." "No confusion needed," Thomas replied calmly. "I'm just a man building something worth protecting." But that is where you are wrong, my friend." Vasquez's smile was cold as the falling snow. "You are building on my territory, using my resources, interfering with my plans for progress." "Your plans." Thomas stepped forward, his boots leaving prints in the fresh snow. "Funny thing about plans, Manuel. They're like buildings. Got to have a solid foundation. Otherwise," he gestured to the papers Judge Morton had taken to the Capitol, "they tend to collapse." Vasquez's smile vanished. "Those letters prove nothing. A few business arrangements, nothing more. They prove enough. Federal marshals are already moving against your operation in 3 territories. Your bought judges are turning evidence. Your empire's falling apart, Manuel." "Then I have nothing left to lose." Vasquez raised his hand, and his men reached for their weapons. "Perhaps I cannot own Shadow Creek, but I can ensure no one else will either." "Could," Thomas corrected, "if this was just you against me, but it's not." He turned slightly, calling out, "Billy, show our friend what we've been building." On cue, shutters opened all along the street. Rifles appeared at windows, on rooftops, Behind barricades, not just Parker's deputies, but townspeople, farmers, merchants, even the school children's parents, all armed, all positioned exactly where Thomas had trained them to be. Impressive, Vasquez admitted, but my men are killers, professionals. Your townspeople are defenders, Thomas finished, fighting for their homes, their future. Amazing how much stronger that makes a person. He stepped closer to Vasquez's horse. But it doesn't have to end in bloodshed. Surrender now, face the law properly, show the same courage James Mackenzie found too late. Vasquez's eyes narrowed. Ah, yes, the Mackenzie boy. His widow's involvement surprised me, I admit. Though, perhaps not as much as this. He reached into his coat and withdrew a familiar object. Thomas's father's silver watch. Recognize this. My men found it in your cabin last night. Amazing how much history one small object can carry. Vasquez smiled again. Your father was a lawman too, no? Died trying to reason with desperate men. Like father? Like son, perhaps? Thomas felt the old rage rising, but kept his voice steady. That watch wasn't yours to take. No? Then come take it back. Vasquez dismounted, letting the watch dangle from his fingers. Just you and me, Mason. One last dance of the old ways, before your precious civilization sweeps them away. Or are you no longer the man you used to be? He's exactly the man he needs to be. Emma's voice rang out from the schoolhouse door. She stood there proudly, shotgun in hand. A builder, a protector, a teacher, and a fighter, Thomas added quietly, when fighting's the only way to protect what matters. The snow fell thicker now, blanketing the town in white silence. Thomas could feel every eye on him. The townspeople he'd trained, the children he'd taught, the woman he'd grown to love. All watching to see if his past would finally tear down everything he'd built. No guns, he said to Vasquez. Just fists. Winner takes the watch and Shadow Creek's future. Vasquez laughed. The famous three-shot Mason, reduced to brawling like a common laborer. Perhaps you truly have changed. More than you know. Thomas removed his gun belt, handed it to Billy. Sometimes building something means getting your hands dirty. The two men circled each other in the snowy street. Vasquez was younger, had probably never worked a day of honest labor in his life. But Thomas had spent 5 years swinging hammers, lifting beams, turning his gunfighter's precision into a builder's strength. Vasquez struck first, a quick combination that showed formal boxing training. Thomas absorbed the blows, letting his opponent wear himself out against shoulders hardened by carpentry. When he countered, it was with the measured force of someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply. The fight was brief but brutal. Vasquez's elegant style crumbled against Thomas's raw power and endurance. When the final blow came, it was almost anticlimactic, a carpenter's uppercut that laid the crime boss flat in the snow. Thomas retrieved his father's watch from Vasquez's unconscious grip. Surrender, he called to the remaining riders, or face the consequences. One by one, weapons clattered to the ground. Sheriff Parker's deputies moved in to make arrests, while Charles Collins read out the federal warrants. The great Manuel Vasquez and his empire, undone not by guns, but by the very civilization he'd tried to corrupt. Mr. Mason! Billy ran up, holding out his gun belt. That was amazing, but why didn't you just shoot him? Thomas knelt beside his apprentice. Because sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is choose not to use his greatest weapon. Remember that, Billy. True strength isn't about what you can destroy. It's about what you choose to build. Emma approached, brushing snow from his shoulders. Speaking of building, the schoolhouse still needs those new desks you promised. He smiled, taking her hand. Reckon it does, and I've got some other building plans to discuss with you, maybe involving a house of our own. Her answer was cut off by cheers from the townspeople. Sarah Collins emerged from the telegraph office, waving a message. Federal troops are an hour out. And the Railroad Commission just confirmed Shadow Creek will be the main junction for the new line. Thomas looked around at his town, his home, the schoolhouse he'd built, now full of learning instead of gun smoke. The people who'd become family, the future rising from the ashes of the past. "Well," he said, squeezing Emma's hand, "looks like we've got more building to do." As if in answer, the snow stopped falling, and weak winter sunlight broke through the clouds. Shadow Creek gleamed white and clean, like a fresh page waiting to be written on. And Thomas Mason, no longer just a gunfighter or just a carpenter, but something new that the frontier desperately needed, was ready to help write that story. The sound of hammering resumed throughout the town, the sound of civilization pushing back the wilderness, of progress defeating corruption, of hope building something stronger than fear. "You know what, Billy?" Thomas said, retrieving his hammer from the schoolhouse steps. "I think your father's right. You're ready to start learning about more than just carpentry. How'd you like to be Shadow Creek's first proper deputy marshal?" Vichy. Boy's eyes lit up. "Really? But what about building things?" "Son, a good lawman builds justice the same way a carpenter builds a house, one piece at a time, with patience and care. And sometimes," he smiled at Emma, "with a little help from the people who believe in you." The federal troops arrived to find Shadow Creek already getting back to work. The prisoners were transferred, the paperwork filed, the formal procedures followed. But the real victory had been won long before. In the moment, a gunfighter chose to become a builder, and a town chose to believe in something stronger than violence. Thomas Mason stood at his workbench that evening, carefully cleaning his father's watch. Emma worked nearby, grading papers, while Billy practiced his letters. Outside, Shadow Creek settled into its winter peace, secure in the knowledge that it had faced its greatest test and emerged stronger. The watch ticked steadily in his hands, marking time not just for him now, but for the future he was helping to build. A future where a man could be more than his past, where a town could be more than its location, where civilization meant more than just laws and buildings. "Time to build something new," he murmured, and set to work. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.